Hello everyone, I'm the Creeps Cabin. I know you use these videos to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I never thought a short trip into the woods would change the way I see the world around me. I had gone out alone that weekend, wanting to clear my head. Life back in town had been pressing in on me. Work, noise, people everywhere, and I wanted silence. I had found a small cabin for rent near the edge of a thick forest, a place that seemed far from everything. It looked old but sturdy, with a narrow gravel road leading up to it. When I first pulled in, the forest around it felt endless, with trees rising tall and close together, blocking most of the daylight even though it was only late afternoon. The cabin itself had no neighbors in sight. From the front porch, I could see only trees in every direction. Behind the cabin, the woods sloped down toward a low valley, and I noticed the way the shadows gathered there, darker than the rest. I unpacked my things, set them inside, and then stood for a while on the porch, breathing in the smell of pine and damp earth. The silence felt heavier than I expected. At first, it was calming, but the longer I stood there, the more it felt like the woods were pressing in on me, watching me. I brushed the feeling off. I had planned to hike, cook some simple meals, and sleep. That was it. No phone calls, no screens, no noise. By the time the sun began to drop, I started a small fire in the stone ring outside the cabin and cooked a quick meal. The light from the flames flickered against the trees, and the smell of smoke mixed with the forest air. It should have been peaceful, but my eyes kept drifting past the firelight into the shadows beyond. I couldn't see much out there. The woods were too dense. When night settled, it did so quickly, as if someone had flipped a switch. One moment the last light of day was slipping between the trees, and the next it was black, the kind of black you only find far from town. I turned on my flashlight a few times, sweeping it through the trees, but the beam only made me feel more exposed. It caught trunks and low branches, but past a certain distance, it was just darkness swallowing the light. I sat close to the fire for a while longer, then went inside. The cabin was small, one room with a bed, a table, and a stove that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I set my things near the bed and lay down, listening to the faint crackle of the fire outside. For a while, all I could hear was my own breathing, but then I started noticing the sounds of the forest. At first, it was only small things, crickets, the occasional snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves. Normal forest sounds. But as the night stretched on, I began to pick out heavier sounds, ones that didn't fit in as easily. A branch breaking with too much force, the sound of something moving through the undergrowth, slow and steady. I told myself it was just animals, deer maybe or raccoons. The woods were full of them, after all. But the longer I lay there, the more I felt the noises lining up with me, circling closer to the cabin. I kept sitting up in bed, staring at the window, but the glass showed nothing beyond its reflection. Around midnight, the sound stopped. Just like that, silence returned, and I eventually drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and felt a bit foolish for how unsettled I'd been. The fire had burned down to ashes, and the ground was damp with dew. The woods looked different in the daylight, less threatening, more like what I had expected when I came here. I decided to take a walk. I followed a narrow trail that started just behind the cabin and wound down into the valley. The air was cool, and the deeper I went, the more the trees closed in overhead. I noticed how quiet it was compared to most hikes I had taken before. There weren't many birds calling, no distant sound of water running. The stillness felt thick. As I walked, I kept glancing back, making sure I could still see the faint outline of the trail. After about an hour, I found a small clearing. The ground there was uneven, with patches of moss and a few stones sticking up. I stopped to rest, setting my pack against a tree. That was when I noticed something strange. In the dirt, there were impressions. At first, I thought they were just deer tracks, but the longer I looked, the less they resembled anything I could identify. They were long, almost like a boot print, but wider, and they sank deeper into the soil than I thought a single step should. I crouched down, running my hand along one of the impressions. It felt old, the edges softened by weather, but it still unsettled me. I stood up quickly, scanning the trees around me. Nothing moved. Still, I felt the same weight in my chest that I had felt the night before. I didn't stay in the clearing long. The rest of the day passed slowly. I made another fire, cooked, and tried to relax, but my eyes kept darting to the tree line. I noticed how easily the forest seemed to hide things. The shadows between the trunks could be empty, or they could be holding something that I couldn't see. Each time a breeze stirred the leaves, I tensed up. That night, the noises returned. Louder this time. I heard the steady crunch of something moving just outside the circle of firelight. I sat in the cabin, lights off, listening. The steps were slow, deliberate, not the random scurrying of animals. My heart pounded in my chest, and I strained to hear. At one point, I thought I heard breathing, heavy and close, but when I looked out the window, there was nothing but blackness. I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin made me jolt awake. At some point near dawn, I heard one last sound, like something brushing against the cabin wall itself, and then silence. When I stepped outside later, the ground near the porch looked disturbed, as if something had pressed into the dirt. I knew I should have left then. Packed up, driven back to town, forgotten the whole thing. But I stayed. I kept telling myself I was imagining it, letting my mind play tricks. I tried to distract myself with small chores, cleaning up the cabin, gathering wood, keeping the fire strong. The third night was the worst. The noises began earlier, just as the sun dipped. This time, they came from all sides, as if something was circling the cabin slowly. The fire popped and hissed outside, but it didn't make me feel safe anymore. The air felt charged, the way it does right before a storm, though the sky was clear. Hours passed like that, my nerves stretched thin. I sat with my back against the wall, flashlight in my lap, waiting. Then, all at once, the sound stopped. The silence was heavy. I waited, holding my breath. That was when I heard it, clear, distinct, right outside the window. A slow inhale, a pause, and then a long, low exhale. I didn't move. My whole body was rigid, my skin prickling with fear. The sound repeated once more, then faded. I didn't dare look. I stayed frozen until the first light of dawn touched the edges of the window. When I finally stepped outside, the ground beneath the window was marked with prints, deep and strange, like the ones I had seen in the clearing. They led back into the trees, vanishing into the shadows. That was enough. I gathered my things, packed quickly, and left the cabin without looking back. As I drove down the gravel road, the forest seemed to close in on both sides, as if it didn't want me to leave. My hands shook on the steering wheel, but I didn't stop until I reached the highway. Even now, the memory of those nights stays sharp. The sound of breathing in the dark, the way the woods seemed to shift and press in, the prints in the soil. I never found out what was out there, and maybe it's better that way. I learned that silence can carry weight, that darkness can hide more than you want to know, and that sometimes the most frightening things are the ones you can't explain, the ones that never show themselves fully. When I think back, I remember the cabin most clearly, the rough wood, the single window, the fire outside. I can see myself sitting there, waiting, listening. I know now that some places are not meant for people, no matter how peaceful they seem in daylight. The forest had its own rules, its own presence, and I had only been a visitor, one who stayed longer than I should have. I never went back. I never even thought about renting another cabin like that again. The woods might look quiet, but I know better now. I know how it feels when something unseen breathes against your window in the middle of the night, and that feeling never leaves. It stays with you long after you've left the trees behind. I woke up earlier than I wanted that morning. The air inside the cabin was cold and heavy, the kind that sinks into your bones when you breathe too deep. The wooden walls held the chill from the night, and the faint smell of damp pine filled the small space. I had planned on sleeping in, but once I was awake, my mind refused to let me drift back down. I lay there staring at the ceiling, following the thin cracks in the wood above me until my eyes hurt from the effort. The forest outside was quiet, too quiet. Usually, I'd hear birds at first light, or the low hum of insects, or even the shifting of branches as squirrels fought over something. But that morning it was still, as though the world outside the cabin had been pressed mute. I pulled myself from the thin blanket, feet hitting the rough floorboards, and stretched until my joints popped. The air smelled stale inside, so I pushed the door open. The hinges groaned, and the moment I stepped onto the small porch, the cold morning air wrapped itself around me. The clearing that surrounded the cabin was drenched in a gray light, the sky hidden by a low layer of clouds. The trees looked darker than they usually did, like something had drawn all the color out of them overnight. I stood there a while, rubbing my arms and trying to shake the strange unease that was already working its way into me. It wasn't like I hadn't stayed here before. I had spent plenty of nights in this cabin, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends. But that morning had a weight to it, like I had walked into a room just after someone whispered something meant only for themselves. The cabin sat in a clearing not much bigger than a small yard. Beyond that, thick woods pressed in from every side. The trees were tall, mostly pine and oak, with thick underbrush in places that made it hard to see far. There was a narrow path leading out, one that wound about half a mile down to the dirt road where I had parked my truck. I had carried in enough supplies the day before to last me for several days: cans, water, a small propane stove, some jerky and nuts. My plan was simple: a few days of quiet, no one around, no phones, no distractions. Just the woods, the cabin, and me. But as I stood on that porch, I couldn't help feeling like I wasn't as alone as I should have been. I scanned the tree line slowly, taking my time with each shadow, each knot in the bark, each space between the branches. Nothing moved. Nothing stirred. I tried to tell myself I was just being paranoid, that the stillness of the morning was only throwing me off. But deep inside, I knew something about this silence wasn't right. I forced myself back inside and lit the small stove to make coffee. The hiss of the flame and the smell of the grounds gave me some comfort, filling the cabin with something human, something familiar. I ate slowly, watching the door more often than I cared to admit. After I finished, I decided I'd take a short walk down to the creek. It wasn't far, maybe 10 minutes through the trees. I thought the sound of water might clear my head. I grabbed my jacket and stepped back outside. The ground was damp from the night's dew, and my boots sank slightly into the soft earth. The air felt colder under the trees, like the branches held back any warmth that tried to pass through. As I walked, I paid attention to every little sound: the crunch of leaves beneath me, the snap of a twig, the low creak of the pines shifting with a breeze too soft to feel. But no birds, no insects, nothing alive except me and the forest itself. The creek was low, barely running, but the trickle of water was enough to cut through the silence. I crouched near the bank, dipped my hands into the cold flow, and splashed my face. The shock of it helped me wake fully, but when I looked up, water dripping from my chin, I froze. Across the creek, maybe 30 feet away, the ground sloped upward into a thicker patch of trees. For just a second, I saw movement there. Something tall, something dark slipping between two trunks. It wasn't an animal, at least not one I recognized. It had moved upright, smooth, deliberate, not the jittery, quick dart of deer or fox. It was gone as quickly as I caught it, swallowed back into the brush, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. My chest tightened, and I stayed crouched there, staring at the spot where it had been. My ears strained for any sound, any sign of movement, but the creak and my own breathing drowned everything else out. I don't know how long I waited, crouched low like prey. Finally, I forced myself up, wiped my face, and started back toward the cabin. Each step felt louder than it should, like I was announcing my exact path through the woods. My neck burned from the constant feeling of eyes pressing against it. I didn't look back, though every nerve screamed for me to. When I reached the clearing, the cabin looked almost too small, too weak to keep anything out. I went inside, shut the door, and locked it. My heart hammered hard in my chest, and I paced the small room, trying to make sense of what I had seen. It could have been another person. Maybe someone was out there hiking, though this wasn't exactly a place people stumbled across. It was too deep in, too far off any marked trail, and whoever it was hadn't made a sound when they moved. It had been quiet, too quiet for a person pushing through brush. My gut told me it hadn't been someone out for a walk. The rest of that day stretched on endlessly. I tried reading, tried writing in the small notebook I had brought, but my eyes kept dragging back to the single window in the cabin and the tree line beyond it. Every so often I swore I saw movement, a darker patch between branches, a shift in the shadows that didn't fit with the sway of the trees. I stopped eating halfway through dinner, no appetite left in me. By the time night began to fall, the silence outside was so heavy I could hear the ringing in my own ears. I lit a lantern, dimmed it as low as it would go, and sat near the door with my back against the wall. I couldn't bring myself to climb into bed. Every creak of the wood, every groan of the cabin settling, made me tense until my muscles ached. Hours crawled by. My eyes burned, but I didn't close them. Then, sometime deep into the night, I heard it. Footsteps. Not animals. Not random shifting. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching lightly over the damp ground. They circled the cabin, just outside. The boards beneath me vibrated faintly with each step, as if the sound was crawling up through the floor itself. I sat there, frozen, my breathing shallow, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped by the porch. The wood groaned under weight that wasn't mine. Then silence. I didn't move. I didn't dare. My whole body felt locked in place, every muscle trembling with tension. Minutes passed, then more. Nothing. No more footsteps. No sound of retreat. I couldn't tell if whoever, or whatever, was out there had left, or if they were still standing just outside the door waiting. At some point, I must have dozed off, because when I opened my eyes again, pale light was creeping through the window. My body ached from sleeping against the wall, but I was alive. I waited, listening, before I finally unlatched the door and stepped out. The clearing looked the same, but near the porch, the ground was disturbed. Not boot prints, not paw prints, but deep impressions in the earth. Long, bare. Human-like, but not quite. The toes seemed too long, the shape stretched in a way that made my stomach twist. They led from the trees to the porch, and then back again, vanishing into the woods. I knew then I couldn't stay. I packed as quickly as my shaking hands would let me. I didn't even bother with breakfast. Every few minutes, I stopped, listening for the sound of footsteps returning. I kept glancing at the trees, certain I'd see something watching. When my bag was ready, I slung it over my shoulder, stepped off the porch, and forced myself onto the path toward the road. The walkout felt 10 times longer than it should have. The trees closed in on both sides, and I couldn't shake the thought of those long prints following just out of sight. I kept turning my head, scanning every inch of shadow. 100 times I thought I heard something, branches snapping, the soft thud of earth under weight. But each time I stopped, the forest gave me nothing back but silence. When I finally saw the dirt road, relief nearly buckled my knees. My truck was still there, waiting, a little island of safety in the middle of nowhere. I hurried across the last stretch, threw my bag into the cab, and climbed inside. My hands shook so badly I struggled with the keys, but when the engine roared to life, I felt a wave of relief like I had never felt before. I pulled onto the road and didn't look back until I was miles away, and even then, the trees behind me looked darker, heavier, as if they held something I would never fully understand. I never went back to that cabin again. I don't even like driving near that stretch of woods anymore. Sometimes late at night, I think about the prints, about the sound of those footsteps circling me while I sat frozen inside. I remind myself it was real, that I didn't imagine it. And when I lie awake in the dark, listening to the silence of my own house, I can almost hear the faint crunch of footsteps just outside, moving slow, patient, waiting for me to forget. I never thought that one simple decision could leave me shaken for the rest of my life. Looking back, it almost feels like it was something waiting for me, like it didn't matter what I chose, I would have ended up there anyway. But the truth is, I chose to go. I chose to step into that moment, into that place, and I learned just how quickly a normal night can turn into something terrifying. It was late summer, the air still heavy and warm, but already hinting at the coming fall. The days had been hot, and the nights cooled down just enough to make sitting outside feel comfortable. I had driven out to a small wooded area just outside of town, a place I liked because it was quiet. People rarely went there, and even fewer stayed after dark. The spot wasn't official parkland, just some old trails cut by hunters and kids looking for a place to drink. There was a clearing in the middle of the woods that I had found a couple months before, and it became a place where I could go and be alone. That night, I packed a small backpack with a flashlight, some water, and a folding chair. I parked my car on the gravel pull-off by the road and followed the narrow path into the trees. It was about a 15-minute walk to the clearing, and as I went, the sounds of the world behind me faded. No cars, no houses, no voices. Just the forest, with its mixture of insects buzzing, leaves rustling, and the occasional sharp crack of a branch snapping somewhere in the distance. I always tried not to think too much about those noises, because if you thought too hard about them, your mind would start inventing reasons for them. Every small sound could turn into footsteps. Every shadow could hide something waiting. I told myself it was just raccoons or deer, maybe even a stray dog moving around. Still, I kept my flashlight in hand, thumb on the switch, ready to snap it on if I had to. The clearing opened up suddenly, a wide circle where the trees stopped, and the grass grew waist-high in some places. I had flattened down a small area for my chair and kept a few stones around from when I had once made a small fire pit. I set the chair down, sat, and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Out there, under the open sky, I always felt both exposed and safe at the same time. Exposed, because there was nothing shielding me from the woods that pressed in all around. Safe, because I could see the tree line in every direction, nothing close enough to sneak up without me noticing. The first hour passed quietly. I listened to the insects, the soft breeze moving through the grass, and the occasional night bird calling from the trees. My phone stayed in my pocket, and I just let the dark settle around me. But after a while, something shifted. I didn't notice it at first. It wasn't sudden, like a loud noise or movement. It was more subtle. I realized that I was leaning forward in the chair, listening harder than before. My eyes kept drifting to the right, toward the far edge of the clearing. At first, I thought I was imagining it. A darker shape among the trees, something that didn't quite match the pattern of branches and shadows. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and told myself it was just my brain adjusting to the dim light. But the longer I stared, the more I felt sure that something, or someone, was standing there, just inside the tree line. I stayed frozen, my hand on the flashlight, but I didn't turn it on yet. I wanted my eyes to stay adjusted to the dark, because the beam of light might blind me for a few seconds when I turned it off again. I tried to focus on the spot, waiting for movement, but nothing happened. After a couple minutes, I convinced myself I was wrong. My mind had just built a shape out of the shadows, the way it does when you stare too long at the dark. I sat back again, but I didn't feel relaxed anymore. The quiet felt heavier now. I realized I couldn't hear any of the night insects that had been buzzing so loud before. The air felt still, like even the breeze had gone. I told myself that sometimes it happened, that the forest had its own rhythms. But my skin prickled, and my stomach twisted. I felt like the whole clearing was holding its breath, waiting for something. Then came the sound. It wasn't loud, but in the silence it felt sharp, cutting straight through everything. A footstep. Not the random snap of a branch from an animal, not the soft scurry of a raccoon. It was heavy, deliberate, and it came from the tree line to my right, the same spot where I thought I had seen the shape. My hand tightened around the flashlight. I turned it on, the beam slicing through the dark, flooding the grass and hitting the trees. For a second, all I saw were trunks, branches, and shadows. Then the beam caught movement. A shape shifted, pulling back, just out of reach of the light. I jerked the beam toward it, but whatever it was had already moved deeper into the trees. My chest tightened, and I could feel the pounding of my heart in my ears. I stood slowly, sweeping the light back and forth along the tree line. Nothing, just the still, waiting forest. I told myself it was an animal, but the sound had been too heavy, too human. I debated packing up right then and leaving, but a part of me didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to accept that someone else had been standing there, watching me. I waited, holding the light steady on the trees, but the forest stayed still. Finally, I shut it off, plunging the clearing back into darkness. My eyes adjusted slowly, and I sat back in the chair, trying to steady my breathing. For a while, nothing happened. My muscles started to loosen, and I almost convinced myself I had overreacted. But then I heard it again. Not from the right this time, but from directly across the clearing. Another footstep, slow, heavy, pressing into the ground. I stood up fast, swinging the flashlight across the clearing. My heart hammered in my chest as the beam lit up the opposite tree line. Again, I caught the faintest flicker of movement, something slipping back behind the cover of the trees, staying just out of full sight. That was enough. I shoved the chair down, grabbed my bag, and started for the path. My flashlight beam shook with my hands as I walked quickly, then faster, until I was nearly jogging. Every few steps, I swung the light behind me, half expecting to see someone following. Nothing, just the endless dark of the forest. The path twisted, and every shadow seemed to move. My breath came hard, and my skin was slick with sweat despite the cool night air. I kept telling myself not to run, that running would make me trip, but my body didn't care. By the time I saw the faint glint of my car through the trees, I was sprinting. I broke out of the woods, nearly throwing myself into the driver's side. I yanked the door open, tossed the bag inside, and slammed it shut behind me. My shaking hands fumbled the keys, and I dropped them once before jamming them into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I threw the car into reverse, tires spitting gravel as I turned back onto the road. As I drove, I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see headlights behind me, or worse, someone standing in the road. But the night stayed empty. It wasn't until I was halfway home that I let myself breathe again. My body ached with the release of tension, my hands cramping from how tightly I had been gripping the wheel. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a long time, the engine off, the world silent. My mind kept replaying the sound of those footsteps, the way the shape slipped just out of sight. Whoever it was, they hadn't called out, hadn't made a sound except for those slow, deliberate steps. They had just watched, waited, and moved along the edge of the clearing, staying in the dark where I couldn't see them. That was the part that stayed with me the most. Not the fear I felt, not the sprint back to the car. It was the knowledge that I had been out there alone, sitting in the open, while someone else had been in the trees, watching me, circling me. And they had never tried to leave the shadows. They wanted me to know they were there, without ever letting me see them fully. I never went back to that clearing again. Even now, when I drive past that stretch of woods, I feel the same tightness in my chest, the same prickle on my skin. I tell myself it was just someone passing through, maybe a hunter or another camper. But deep down, I know it wasn't that simple. Because if it was, why didn't they ever step out into the light? Why didn't they say a word? Why did they stay hidden, circling, waiting, until I finally fled? And why, even now, do I sometimes feel the same sensation I felt that night? The weight of unseen eyes on me, watching from just beyond the edge of the light. I had decided to take a short trip into the woods on a weekend when I didn't have much going on. I told myself it would be a simple hike, nothing serious, just a way to clear my head and spend a night alone away from the usual noise of everyday life. I packed my backpack with the things I thought I would need: a tent, sleeping bag, small cooking stove, a little bit of food, water, a flashlight, and a knife just in case. The drive out to the area was uneventful, the kind of drive where the road gets more narrow and the trees grow taller and closer together as you go farther. The air seemed fresher as I rolled the windows down, cooler too, and the smell of pine was so strong it almost felt sharp in my nose. When I finally parked, there wasn't another car in sight. The gravel lot was small, uneven, and cracked, with weeds poking through. There was a small wooden sign, weathered and faded, that marked the trail. I shouldered my pack, locked the car, and started walking. The path started out wide, covered in a layer of dried leaves that crunched under every step. Sunlight still slipped through the branches, broken up into golden patches on the ground. My boots pressed down on them, each sound carrying farther than I expected in the quiet of the woods. I walked slowly, trying to adjust to the extra weight of the pack and get used to the silence. As I went deeper, the trees grew closer together, the path narrowing and twisting. It wasn't a hard hike, but the silence was thick. My breathing, the sound of my boots, and the occasional caw of a crow were the only interruptions. Time slipped by strangely, as if the forest swallowed up the hours. Eventually, I reached a small clearing just big enough for my tent. The ground was fairly even, and there was a fallen tree nearby that I could use as a kind of seat. It felt like the right spot. Setting up camp was simple. I laid down my pack, stretched my back, and began unrolling the tent. The earth was firm but damp beneath the top layer of leaves. I hammered the stakes in, pulled the rain fly over, and arranged my sleeping bag inside. It wasn't anything special, but it looked comfortable enough. I sat down on the log, pulled out some food, and ate slowly. The quiet of the woods made every crunch and bite sound too loud, like I was disturbing something that didn't want to be disturbed. As the sun dropped lower, the clearing dimmed quickly. The trees cut the light sharply, and shadows stretched across the ground. I lit my small stove, boiled some water, and made myself something warm. I could feel the temperature dropping already. A chill carried through the trees, brushing against my skin and making me pull my jacket tighter. After eating, I decided to collect some wood for a fire. Even though I had the stove, something about having a fire felt safer. I walked just beyond the clearing, searching for branches that were dry and not too thick. I gathered an armful and carried them back. On the second trip, I wandered a little deeper. The trees looked darker now, and the undergrowth tangled around my boots. At one point, I bent down to pick up a good piece of wood when I noticed how still the forest had become. The breeze had stopped, and I couldn't hear any birds or insects. For a moment, It was like standing in a room where everything had been muted. I shook it off, told myself it was nothing, and carried the wood back to camp. The fire started easier than I thought. The flames caught on the smaller twigs, then spread to the thicker branches. Soon, the fire was bright enough to push back some of the shadows around me. I sat close, feeling the heat, listening to the pops and cracks of the burning wood. Night came quickly, faster than I was ready for. The sky darkened into a deep blue, then black, with only thin cracks of stars showing through the canopy. As the night deepened, the forest seemed to change. The shadows thickened, the trees became looming shapes, and every sound carried differently. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, when I first noticed movement just beyond the light. It wasn't clear at first, just the sense that something shifted between the trees. I squinted, leaned forward slightly, but couldn't see anything solid. My heartbeat quickened, and I told myself it was just my imagination. But then I heard it, a faint crunch of leaves. Slow, deliberate. Not the random sound of something falling, not the wind. This was the sound of weight pressing down. My skin prickled, and I stayed very still listening. The fire popped, and for a moment I thought maybe it was just a deer or some other animal. But the steps didn't sound like an animal moving casually. They were spaced out, heavy, as if whoever, or whatever, it was being careful not to make noise but failing to be silent. I stood slowly, the fire at my back, the knife in my hand now. My eyes tried to pierce the darkness, but it was impossible to see beyond the small circle of firelight. I turned in slow circles, watching, waiting, holding my breath at times to hear better. The steps had stopped. The forest returned to silence. I told myself to calm down, to sit back down and not overthink it. I forced myself onto the log again, staring into the fire, but my body was tense. My ears strained to pick up anything. And then, just when I had convinced myself it was nothing, I heard it again. Closer this time. A soft drag of a boot or a shoe across leaves. My mouth went dry. I got up again, this time moving toward the edge of the light, holding my flashlight in one hand and the knife in the other. I flicked the light on, aiming it into the woods. The beam cut through the dark, revealing the rough bark of trees, the uneven ground, the undergrowth. Nothing moved. Nothing shifted. I swept the light slowly, trying not to miss anything, but there was only emptiness. Still, the feeling of being watched pressed down hard on me. I backed toward the fire and sat again, this time with the flashlight resting across my lap. My chest felt tight, every muscle ready to spring. Minutes dragged by like hours. The fire burned lower, so I added more wood, forcing myself to move quickly, almost clumsily. The flames rose again, crackling, but I didn't feel safer. The steps came back later, faint but steady. Not rushing, not stumbling. Just careful, patient. I realized with a chill that whoever it was had circled me. The steps seemed to come from a different direction than before. My stomach twisted, and my breathing became shallow. This wasn't an animal. This was someone moving around me, keeping distance, waiting. I stayed awake the whole night, staring at the dark, the fire burning down, and then being fed again whenever it dropped too low. I never saw anyone, never caught a clear shape or figure, but the sound of footsteps circled, paused, and shifted again and again until the sky finally lightened in the east. When dawn finally came, the forest looked normal again. The trees stood quiet and still, the ground damp with morning dew. I felt sick with exhaustion but relieved. I decided not to stay another night. I packed everything as quickly as I could, my hands trembling from lack of sleep and nerves. When I went to collect the last few things, I noticed something that froze me in place. Just beyond the edge of my clearing, in the soft earth between the trees, were footprints. Human footprints. Not boots like mine, but worn-down shoes. The prints were fresh, pressed deep into the dirt, circling the clearing exactly as I had heard the night before. Some were so close to where I had been sitting by the fire that I could see the tread clearly. I didn't think, I just grabbed my pack and left. The trail back felt longer than before, every step heavy, my nerves stretched thin. I kept looking over my shoulder, certain I was being followed, though I never saw anyone. By the time I reached the gravel lot, the sight of my car was almost enough to make me collapse. I threw my pack in, got behind the wheel, and drove away without even taking one last look. The silence of the woods stayed with me, though, pressing in on me even as the road widened and other cars appeared. I didn't relax until I was back in town, surrounded by noise and people. That night, when I lay in my own bed, I thought about those footprints. Whoever it was had been right there, just out of sight, walking circles around me while I sat awake by the fire. They could have stepped in at any moment if they wanted to. The thought of that stayed with me long after, heavier than anything else. The woods had felt so big and empty at first, but that night, I learned just how close someone can be when you least expect it. I never thought a simple trip out in the woods would end the way it did, but when I look back on it now, it all makes sense why every step of that day still plays over in my head. I can still feel the ground under my boots, the weight of the backpack digging into my shoulders, and the way the air changed when things started to go wrong. It wasn't supposed to be anything more than a quiet hike, just me and the trail, but it became something else entirely, something that still keeps me awake at night. The morning had started off calm. I parked my car near the trailhead where only a couple of other vehicles sat, probably belonging to hunters or other hikers who had gotten an earlier start. The forest stretched out in front of me, thick with pines, oaks, and underbrush that tangled so close it was like stepping into a wall of green. The air was cool, the kind that makes you pull your jacket tight, but feels refreshing after being in the car. The dirt lot behind me was quiet, no sound of traffic, just the distant calls of crows and the steady hum of insects. I slung my backpack over my shoulders, locked the car, and headed up the trail. The ground was soft from rain earlier in the week, but dry enough that my boots didn't sink. Each step made a muted crunch, and the deeper I walked, the more I noticed how the noises of the world faded away. No engines, no voices, not even the sound of planes above. Just me, my breathing, and the forest pressing in around me. For a long while it felt peaceful. I liked the way the sunlight filtered through the branches, painting shifting patterns on the ground. I noticed deer tracks pressed into the mud near the start of the trail, and even a set of raccoon prints cutting across toward a stream I could hear rushing nearby. I stopped to drink some water and just listened, breathing in the smell of damp leaves and pine needles. But somewhere around noon, something shifted. It wasn't anything big at first, just a slow awareness that I wasn't as alone as I thought. I had that prickling feeling on the back of my neck, like eyes were on me. I stopped walking and scanned the trees, trying to shake it off as nothing. The woods were thick, and I couldn't see far in any direction. It made sense that my mind would play tricks on me. But even telling myself that didn't make the feeling go away. I pushed on, moving slower now, paying more attention to the sounds around me. The forest wasn't silent, but it was strange. The bird calls had become scattered, as if they'd moved off somewhere else. The wind had died down too, leaving the air heavy and still. My boots scraped against roots and stones, each sound too loud in the quiet. Not long after, I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a shadow between the trees, but when I squinted, I realized it was a shape, tall and upright, moving slowly across the ridge a couple 100 feet ahead. The figure didn't stop, didn't look around, just kept walking until it disappeared behind the slope. My chest tightened. I wasn't expecting to see anyone way out here, especially not off the main trail. They hadn't waved, hadn't called out, hadn't even changed pace when I saw them. I stood there a long time, trying to decide what to do. It could have been another hiker, maybe a hunter checking the land, but something about the way they moved bothered me. There had been no pause, no hesitation, as if they knew exactly where they were going and didn't care who saw them. I tried to shake it off. People hike all the time, I told myself. There was no reason to overthink it. Still, I felt uneasy, like I had seen something I wasn't supposed to. I tightened the straps on my backpack and walked on, keeping my head down, pretending I hadn't noticed. By late afternoon, I stopped to gather firewood near the edge of the forest. I wasn't camping out there overnight, but I liked to make small fires at rest stops when I hiked longer trails, just to sit and eat near. I stepped just inside the trees, snapping smaller branches off fallen logs and piling them into my arms. The deeper I went, the darker it got, the light from the open field behind me swallowed up by the thick canopy overhead. That's when I heard it. A sound so clear it froze me where I stood, heavy breathing. Not the kind of panting an animal makes, not the fast huff of a deer or the grunts of a boar. This was human. Slow, steady, ragged breaths, close enough that I could hear the wetness in them. My heart lurched, and I turned my head, scanning the trees. I didn't see anyone at first, but I could sense movement. Something shifted behind a trunk, and for a split second, I caught the blur of a figure slipping between the branches. The breathing grew faint, moving farther away, but I knew without a doubt it had been right behind me moments earlier. The wood slipped from my arms. My legs carried me before I even made the choice, running back through the trees toward the open field where my pack lay. My chest ached, my throat burned, but I didn't stop until I burst out of the shadows into the clearing, panting harder than I ever had in my life. I forced myself to calm down, sitting on a fallen log, trying to slow my breathing. My ears rang with the rush of blood, but under it, the forest was too quiet again. I felt exposed in that clearing, yet the thought of stepping back into the trees made my skin crawl. Whoever, or whatever, that had been, it had followed me close enough to breathe down my neck, and I hadn't heard a single footstep until it was already there. I didn't stay long after that. I stuffed what little wood I had into my pack, didn't bother with the fire, and started back down the trail toward the car. Every bend in the path made me nervous. I kept glancing over my shoulder, certain I'd see someone standing there, watching. I moved quickly, but not so fast that I tripped. The silence was unbearable, the kind that makes every crack of a twig under your boot sound like a warning shot. The hike back felt endless. My legs grew heavy, and my eyes scanned constantly, darting at every shadow. By the time I reached the dirt lot, the sun was dipping low, painting the tops of the trees in gold. My car sat alone now, the other vehicles gone. I fumbled the keys, my hands slick with sweat. I opened the door and slid in, locking it instantly. My chest finally eased a little when I turned the engine over, but even then, I couldn't shake the thought that I had been followed the whole way back. I half expected to see a figure at the tree line as I pulled away, but when I looked, the woods stood still and empty. Driving out, I realized something that chilled me more than anything else. There hadn't been any footprints on the trail besides mine when I walked back. The ground was soft enough that I should have seen them, but I hadn't. And yet I know what I heard, what I saw moving between those trees, what I felt breathing so close behind me. I don't go back there anymore. Every time I think about it, my mind replays the sound of those breaths and the sight of that figure on the ridge. Someone was out there that day, someone who didn't want to be found, someone who followed me without a word. I was lucky to make it back to my car, lucky to drive away with nothing worse than the memory. But the truth is, I'll never know who it was, what they wanted, or how long they watched me before I finally noticed. And that's the part that keeps me awake. The thought that maybe they're still out there, watching someone else, stepping quietly enough to never be seen until it's already too late. It started as a simple plan, nothing unusual or strange about it. I had been working all week, feeling drained and tired of the noise of the city, so I decided to head out for a quick trip alone. I wanted quiet, fresh air, and space to clear my head. There was a small cabin tucked into the woods about 2 hours from my place that I had rented before, and I knew it was the kind of spot where you rarely saw another person. The dirt road that led out to it wasn't marked well, and most people didn't even know the place was there. It was exactly the kind of isolation I wanted. At least that's what I thought at the time. The drive out was calm. The highway stretched for miles with barely any cars, and when I turned off onto the narrow roads that wound into the forest, the feeling of being far away from everything sank in. The road grew rougher the closer I got to the cabin, stones popping under the tires, trees pressing closer to the edges. I kept rolling down the windows to smell the pine and feel the cool air. By the time I pulled into the small clearing where the cabin sat, the sun was dipping low. The light caught the wooden frame of the cabin and the trees around it, making everything look golden for a moment. I unpacked slowly, taking my bag inside, and then coming back out for the cooler I had stuffed with food. The cabin was simple. One room, a wood stove, a small table, a bed, and some shelves with old supplies left behind by whoever managed the place. No electricity, no phone signal. The silence was heavy but good at first. I made a small fire outside as the last light drained from the sky. I cooked a simple meal and sat near the fire until the night settled in fully. The woods became a wall of black around me, broken only by the glow of the flames. I kept catching myself staring into the tree line. It wasn't that I heard anything in particular. It was just the kind of darkness that makes you think too much. Every shape seemed like it could be something else. Every sound stretched longer than it should. I went inside after a while, locked the door, and sat at the little table with a lantern burning. The cabin walls creaked now and then as the wood cooled. I tried to relax, but something in me felt restless. I told myself I just wasn't used to the silence after so much noise in my daily life. Still, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling for what felt like hours before finally drifting off. Sometime in the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. The lantern had burned out, and the cabin was pitch black. I listened and thought maybe it was just the wind against the trees, but then I heard it again. A sound that didn't fit. It was faint, but clear enough. Footsteps outside in the dirt. Slow, dragging steps circling around the cabin. My chest tightened instantly. I held my breath and tried to convince myself it could be an animal. But the weight of the steps, the uneven rhythm of them, it wasn't an animal. It was someone moving deliberately, slow and steady, as if they didn't care if I heard them. I stayed completely still, waiting, my ears straining. The steps paused on one side of the cabin, then started again, moving along the wall. I thought about grabbing the small hunting knife I had brought, but I didn't move. The wooden door didn't feel like much protection. My mind ran in every direction at once. Was it someone lost, someone camping nearby, or someone who had seen my car and decided to check the place out? None of those thoughts gave me comfort. After a while, the steps grew faint and seemed to fade into the woods. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, waiting to hear them again, but nothing came. When the first light of morning filled the cracks around the shutters, I finally let out the breath I'd been holding all night. I went outside slowly, checking the clearing. The ground was disturbed in a way I couldn't ignore. Clear footprints circled the cabin, some pressed deeper than others into the soft dirt. They weren't fresh boots, either. The tread was worn down, smoothed out with use. Whoever it was had walked around the cabin at least twice, close to the walls, pausing in spots as if listening or looking in. I spent the day restless, trying to shake it off. I forced myself to go about normal things, chopping wood, walking a little along the trails, cooking, but I couldn't stop glancing at the trees. I thought about packing up and leaving, but part of me kept saying it was just a strange moment, maybe someone out hunting or wandering. Still, the prints were burned into my mind. By the time night fell again, I had already locked myself inside and built up the fire in the stove. I sat on the bed with the lantern lit, knife on the table within reach. Every sound outside seemed sharper now. Hours passed, and I began to think maybe it had been nothing. Maybe I would just get through the night. Then I heard it again. The same dragging, uneven steps. This time slower. They came from the same direction, circling the cabin just as before. My whole body tensed. The fire popped inside the stove, and I worried the sound would make whoever it was know I was awake. The steps stopped right outside the window for a long time. Too long. I stared at the wall, picturing someone standing inches from the thin wooden planks, breathing, listening. Minutes dragged by before the steps started again. They moved to the door and stopped there. I sat frozen, my hand gripping the knife so hard my fingers ached. The door creaked lightly as if tested. Not pushed hard, not kicked, just tested. Then silence. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just waited. Eventually, I thought maybe the person had gone, but I couldn't be sure. The silence stretched into hours. I must have dozed off sitting upright, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was spilling into the cabin. I went outside again, and there they were. The same prints circling, stopping at the windows and door. This time there were more of them. The dirt churned up as if whoever it was had stood there for longer, shifting their weight back and forth. I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed quickly, loading everything into the car. The whole time I kept checking the trees, half expecting to see someone watching me. When I finally drove off down the rough road, my hands were tight on the wheel, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. I didn't see anyone, not once on the way out, but I couldn't shake the thought that someone had been there on purpose. Not lost, not curious, but standing outside that cabin in the dark, circling and waiting. When I reached the highway, the tension didn't ease. Even now, I can still hear those dragging steps in my head, slow and deliberate, pacing just outside thin wooden walls. And I know if I had stayed one more night, if I had let myself believe it was nothing, the story might not have ended with me driving away at all. I remember the day so clearly because it began so normal, nothing strange about it at all, and yet it turned into something that has never left my mind. I had decided to go for a hike on my own, something I sometimes did when I felt restless. There was this old logging trail not too far from where I lived, tucked back behind farmland and fields, leading straight into miles of woods that seemed to stretch forever. It wasn't a popular place for people to go, which was part of the reason I liked it. The quiet always seemed heavier there, thicker than in other places, and it gave me space to think. That morning the sky was pale gray, not stormy but not sunny either, just that washed-out color that makes the day feel slower than it really is. I parked my car at the edge of a dirt road, packed a bottle of water and a snack into my small backpack, and started down the trail. The air smelled like damp leaves and soil, with that sharp coolness that comes from shaded woods. The path itself was wide at first, the remains of where trucks had once gone through years ago, but weeds and saplings had started taking it back. The deeper I went, the more narrow it became, until it was just a single dirt track lined with roots and fallen branches. The forest grew thick quickly. Trees pressed in from both sides, blocking out most of the light. Everything seemed muffled, like sound didn't travel far here. My own footsteps were steady, but they echoed only faintly. A crow called somewhere far off, then silence. I walked for maybe an hour, losing track of time, just following the path deeper and deeper until I reached a point where the trail forked. The left side looked more worn, but I had already been that way once before, so I took the right. The right path was rougher, covered in fallen sticks and patches of mud. It sloped downward slowly, leading toward the darker part of the forest where the trees grew taller and closer together. I liked that feeling of being swallowed up by the woods, hidden away from everything else. But after a while, I noticed something that put a chill through me. The further I walked, the less the trail looked like a trail. It thinned out until it was hard to tell if I was even on a real path anymore. I slowed down, trying to keep track of where I had come from, but everything started to look the same. Trees, brush, patches of moss, little dips in the ground, it all blended together. I told myself I'd just walk a little further and then turn back, but before long I couldn't even tell which way was back. I stopped and stood still listening. The forest was dead quiet. Not a single bird, not a squirrel moving, nothing. That's when I felt it, that heavy awareness of being watched. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but my gut didn't believe that. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees. That's when I saw it. At first it looked like just movement, something shifting between the trees about 50 feet away. Not fast, not loud, but enough to catch my eye. I stared hard, but all I saw was the outline of something stepping just out of view. I waited, heart thudding, eyes locked on the spot, and then I heard it. The sound of heavy breathing. It wasn't mine. It came from that direction, low and deep, almost like someone exhausted. It stopped when I took a step, then started again when I froze. I couldn't see anyone, but the sound was real, steady, and close enough to make the hair on my neck rise. I backed up slowly, my boots crunching on leaves, trying not to make noise. The breathing seemed to move too, shifting in rhythm with me, always staying just out of sight. I felt trapped. Running blindly in the woods was dangerous. One wrong step, and I could twist an ankle, fall into a hole, or worse. But standing there wasn't an option either. I started moving faster, trying to retrace where I'd come from, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. The breathing grew fainter, like it was pulling back, and for a moment I thought maybe it was gone. But then I caught movement again, this time on my left side, deeper in the trees. A figure, dark and tall, slipping between trunks. I didn't wait to see more. I broke into a run, not caring about the noise I made, just focusing on moving as fast as I could. The branches whipped against my arms, the ground uneven under my feet. I pushed forward until I nearly tripped over a fallen log, catching myself just in time. My lungs burned, my chest tight, but I didn't stop. The thought of whatever that was trailing me kept my legs pumping. After what felt like forever, I stumbled onto a section of trail that looked more familiar. Relief hit me, but it was sharp and nervous, not calming. I recognized a bend in the path, and knew I was at least facing the right way toward where my car was. I didn't slow down. I kept running until the trees thinned, and I could see the faint outline of the field near the edge of the forest. When I finally broke out of the woods, the sudden openness of the field nearly made me dizzy. I stopped in the middle of the clearing, bent over, gasping for air. I kept looking back at the tree line, half expecting to see someone step out after me. But nothing came. The woods stood still, silent, giving away no sign that anything had been there. I walked the rest of the way back to my car, shaking, ears straining for any sound behind me. My hands fumbled with the keys when I reached it, and I locked the doors the second I got inside. I sat there for several minutes, just breathing, staring into the forest. Not a single movement, not a single noise. I told myself maybe it was an animal, maybe my imagination, but I knew what I had heard. That breathing wasn't like a deer or a bear. It was human, slow, deliberate. And the way it moved when I moved, the way it kept just far enough back to stay hidden, it wasn't chance. I drove home with the windows up and the doors locked tight. I never told anyone about it because I didn't want to hear the word imagination or overreaction. But deep down I knew better. Someone had been out there in those woods with me, following me, watching me, keeping close enough to let me know without ever showing their face. And the part that chills me even now is knowing I'll never know who it was, or why they were out there, or what might have happened if I hadn't run when I did. I still pass that dirt road sometimes, and every time I do, I feel that same heavy awareness, like eyes pressing from the shadows of the trees, waiting for someone else to step inside. That day taught me something I'll never forget. The forest isn't empty just because it looks empty. Sometimes it's what you can't see that's the most dangerous, and sometimes walking out alive doesn't mean you escaped. It only means you got lucky. It started out as a normal plan, something that felt simple enough when I thought about it during the day. I had been craving some time away from everything, away from the noise, away from the constant routine. The idea of spending a night out in the woods felt right. I packed my bag with what I thought I would need, checked my flashlight twice, made sure I had a lighter, some food, a water bottle, and a blanket. I told myself it would just be a quick camping trip, one night to clear my head. The place I picked wasn't too far from home, just a few miles outside town. It wasn't a marked campground, but it was a spot I had noticed before when driving. A small dirt pull-off on the side of the road led into a clearing that sloped down toward a stretch of woods. The field was wide, flat, and covered in tall grass that swayed when the wind touched it. The forest on the far side stood like a wall, thick and dark, and once the sun went down, it turned into a solid black mass. From the road, you wouldn't even notice it was there unless you stopped. I parked my car along the dirt pull-off, slung the bag over my shoulder, and started walking down into the clearing. It was quiet, the kind of quiet where you notice how loud your own breathing is. There was a soft hum of crickets, and sometimes the faint sound of something moving in the grass, but I told myself it was just small animals. Rabbits, maybe. The grass brushed against my legs as I made my way to a spot where the ground leveled out. I could still see the faint glow of the road if I turned back, but ahead of me was only the black outline of trees. I built a small fire with the wood I collected near the tree line. The flames crackled low, and the warmth was comforting, but I couldn't shake the feeling of how alone it felt. The sky above stretched wide, stars scattered across it. I remember tilting my head back and trying to count them, my eyes darting from one small point of light to another. I thought maybe this was what I came here for, just this quiet space, just to feel small under the sky. But then I noticed movement. At first, it didn't register. My eyes caught something shifting along the ridge of the hill about 200 feet away. The ridge rose up on the far side of the clearing, just before the woods thickened again. In the fading light, I could see the outline of a figure walking across the ridge, steady, not hurried, but straight, like they knew exactly where they were going. It wasn't the shape of an animal, it was upright, human. I stared hard, waiting to see if they would stop or look in my direction. But they didn't. They just kept walking until they reached the far edge of the ridge and disappeared behind it. I tried to convince myself it was nothing unusual. Maybe it was just someone out walking. Farmers sometimes checked their land, or maybe it was a hiker. But the way they didn't stop, didn't hesitate, just walked until they vanished. It left a weight in my stomach. I sat by the fire longer than I needed to, just listening, trying to hear if they were moving closer, but the night answered with nothing. Later, when the fire burned low, I decided I needed more wood. I grabbed my flashlight and walked into the edge of the forest. The air under the trees was cooler, damp, and carried the smell of earth. The ground was uneven, scattered with branches and leaves that cracked under my shoes. My flashlight beam cut through the trunks, pale light catching on the rough bark. I bent down to pick up a thick piece of wood, then froze. There was a sound behind me. It wasn't a branch breaking, not exactly. It was heavy, steady, like breathing. Slow and deep at first, then heavier, as though whatever was there had just exerted itself. I stood still, my hand tight around the wood, my heart thudding against my ribs. I turned my head slowly, shining the light into the trees. At first, I didn't see anything, just layers of trunks and shadows. But then I caught it, movement, just a small shift in the dark. Not clear enough to see a shape, not enough to define it as a person, but enough to know something was there. The breathing grew fainter, moving away, fading deeper into the trees. I wanted to follow the sound with my flashlight, to see what it was, but my body wouldn't move. My throat was dry, and my hands were shaking. The sound of the breathing kept going until it was gone. I forced myself to collect the wood I had, clutching it against my chest, and walked quickly back out to the clearing. When I reached the fire, I piled the wood on and sat down, trying to calm myself. I told myself again it was probably an animal, maybe a deer, maybe something else. But the weight of the sound, the way it had felt like it was right behind me, close enough that if I had turned a second earlier, I might have seen it, that stayed heavy in my chest. The night dragged on. The fire's glow seemed smaller with every passing hour, the darkness around me stretching wider. I couldn't stop glancing toward the ridge, half expecting to see the figure again. I kept the flashlight close, switching it on and off, scanning the grass, the tree line, anywhere movement might show. Every sound carried weight, the rustle of leaves, the crack of something shifting in the grass, the sudden burst of an insect wing near my ear. At one point, I thought I saw something again near the trees. Just a flicker, the suggestion of movement between trunks. I told myself not to imagine things, but my body wouldn't believe my mind. My shoulders stayed tense, my eyes straining against the dark. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I sat up the entire night, the fire long gone cold, my flashlight beam flicking across the clearing again and again. Sometimes I thought I heard the breathing again, faint, somewhere past the trees, but I never saw anything clear. Just shadows, always shifting, never still long enough to explain. When the sky finally started to lighten, the field slowly turning gray, I felt my whole body ease. The woods didn't look as heavy with daylight creeping back in. I stood, stretched my stiff legs, and walked back toward the car. The clearing felt empty, quiet in a way that was almost normal again. But I couldn't shake the feeling I had been watched. Not once, but all night. On the drive home, every time I looked in the mirror, I expected to see something sitting in the back seat. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles ached. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I swore I wouldn't do that again. Not alone. Not in that place. The memory of the figure on the ridge, the sound of that breathing behind me, the way it faded into the dark, it followed me. I tried to explain it away, but there was no way to erase how real it felt. I knew someone, or something, had been there, and I knew it hadn't wanted me to see it. Even now, when I think back to that night, what unsettles me most isn't the figure or the breathing. It's the silence that came after. The way it slipped back into the dark without a trace, as if it belonged there and I didn't. That was the moment I realized the woods didn't care that I was there. They belonged to something else, and for that one night, I had stepped into its place. And it let me leave. It started out as a normal trip. At least that's how I thought of it when I first left the house. I had been working long hours for weeks, barely seeing the outside of my office or my apartment. My head felt heavy, my eyes strained, and my body restless from the same routine. I wanted to get away, even if it was just for a single night, and I figured a short camping trip would help me breathe again. I didn't plan it with anyone else, because I didn't want company. I wanted quiet, fresh air, and space that wasn't crowded by walls. I packed my backpack with the usual things: a tent, sleeping bag, some food, water bottles, and a flashlight. I left in the late afternoon, driving out of town until the road narrowed and the trees grew taller, blotting out the horizon. The air was cool when I parked by the side of a dirt road, locked my car, and started walking into the woods. I had no exact spot in mind, just the idea of following the trail until I felt I was far enough to be alone. The path was uneven, covered in roots and rocks, and the deeper I went, the quieter it became. The sound of cars faded quickly, and all that was left was the crunch of my boots and the rustling of leaves high above me. Every step felt like I was shaking off the noise of the world, peeling away the weight of the city. I liked the silence. By the time the sun dipped behind the hills, I had found a small clearing just big enough to pitch my tent. It was near a slope, and not far from a thin line of trees that separated the clearing from a denser part of the forest. The grass was low, the ground firm, and I set my tent there without thinking too much about it. I gathered some sticks and built a small fire to cook a simple meal. As I sat there, Chewing slowly, I realized how much I missed the simple act of hearing nothing but the crackle of fire and the occasional chirp of a bird or insect. Darkness settled quickly, thicker than it ever felt in the city. I could see the stars above, clearer than I had in years, and for a while, I just lay back on the ground staring at them. The fire burned lower until it was just glowing embers, and I crawled into my tent, tired but calm. The ground was cold under my sleeping bag, but I didn't mind. The forest around me seemed still. I drifted off, thinking I had finally found the peace I was looking for. Sometime in the night, I woke up. I don't know why exactly, but something pulled me out of sleep. The tent was dark, but my ears picked up faint noises outside. It wasn't the normal sound of branches swaying or leaves brushing against each other. It was heavier, more deliberate, like footsteps, slow, steady, circling. My chest tightened as I lay completely still, listening. At first, I thought maybe it was a deer or something similar, but the steps were too controlled. They stopped for long moments, then shifted again, moving just beyond the thin wall of fabric separating me from the night. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, maybe my imagination, maybe the forest shifting, but the sound was too real. Minutes dragged on like hours. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Then slowly, the sound faded, and the forest fell back into its regular stillness. I didn't dare check outside. I stayed inside the tent, staring into the dark, until exhaustion forced my eyes closed again. When I woke with daylight, I tried to brush it off. I told myself maybe it had been an animal, maybe I had dreamt half of it. I stepped outside, and the ground was damp with morning dew. I walked a slow circle around the tent, and that's when I noticed it. The grass was flattened in places, in shapes too close to footprints to be ignored. They weren't clear enough to see shoes, but I could tell something or someone had moved there during the night. My stomach sank. I thought about packing up and leaving, but the sun was shining, and the forest looked harmless again. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I was just on edge. I convinced myself to stay, at least for the day. I wanted to enjoy the time away. I collected firewood, wandered the area, and even found a stream not too far down the slope where the water was clear and cold. For hours, everything felt normal again, and I managed to shake off the unease. By evening, I had a stronger fire going and sat close to it as the sky darkened. The air grew colder, and the forest sounds returned. I ate, warmed myself, and finally crawled into the tent again when the fire was nothing but glowing coals. My body was tired, but my mind was restless, replaying the sounds from the night before. When it happened again, it was worse. I woke to the same slow crunching steps outside the tent. They were closer this time, not moving in wide circles, but pacing right beside where I lay. The sound of weight pressing grass and soil filled my ears. Then it stopped, and I could hear breathing. Heavy, steady, deliberate breathing, just beyond the fabric. I didn't move. My hands gripped the edges of my sleeping bag, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. The breathing shifted, low and steady, as if whoever it was leaned closer. I wanted to grab the flashlight, to shine it, but I was frozen. I felt the press of fear like a weight on my chest. Time dragged. I couldn't tell how long it lasted, but eventually, the sound pulled away. The footsteps retreated, slow at first, then fading into the distance. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn filtered through the tent. When I finally stepped outside, my stomach twisted again. This time, there were clearer prints in the soft earth. Not animal prints. Shoe prints. Someone had been there. I stared at them, following the faint trail toward the tree line, but I didn't go far. My mind raced with questions I didn't want answers to. I decided to leave. I packed my things as quickly as I could, shoving everything into my bag without care. My eyes kept flicking to the trees, waiting for something to move, for someone to appear. The hike back to the road felt longer than when I came. Every step, I felt watched. The forest that had felt peaceful yesterday now pressed down on me, closing in. When I finally reached my car, my hands shook as I unlocked it and threw my gear inside. I sat for a moment, trying to steady my breathing before starting the engine. I didn't look back as I drove away, but I couldn't shake the image of the footprints outside my tent, the sound of breathing in the dark. That night, when I lay in my own bed, safe inside walls and under a roof, I realized how close I might have been to something far worse. I thought of the footsteps circling me, the breathing just outside, and the fact that whoever it was never revealed themselves. They didn't need to. They wanted me to know they were there. I never went camping alone again. Even now, years later, the memory sticks with me. The woods are wide and silent, but not empty. And sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I still hear the slow, heavy steps outside the thin wall of my tent, waiting in the dark. I had always thought of myself as someone who could handle being alone outdoors. I had gone on hikes before, spent nights camping with friends, even walked home late at night through quiet streets without feeling like something was wrong. But this one trip changed the way I thought about being outside, about how much I trusted the safety of empty places. It started with me deciding to spend a weekend by myself in the woods, something I had been thinking about for a while. I told myself it would be peaceful, a way to get away from everything for a couple of days. I brought a small tent, some food, water, and enough gear to last. I parked my car near a trail that led deeper into the forest, then carried my things in until I found a spot that felt private and quiet. The first day was calm. I set up the tent, gathered firewood, and cooked a simple meal as the sun began to sink. The forest had that strange quietness it always gets in the evening, where the air feels heavy and still. I remember sitting on a log near the fire, listening to the sounds of birds going silent, the soft rustling of branches when a breeze passed through, and the distant crack of twigs somewhere deeper in the trees. None of it bothered me then. It just felt normal. I thought about how nice it was to be away from noise, away from people, away from all the distractions I was used to. But as night came on, the place began to feel different. The woods seemed to close in, the shadows stretching longer between the trees, making the spaces between them look like endless black corridors. The fire was small, but enough to light the little clearing I had chosen, though everything outside that circle of light looked darker than it had in the day. I could hear the forest still, but the sounds were harder to place now. Twigs snapping somewhere, something moving through the undergrowth, leaves shifting even when there wasn't wind. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just animals, maybe deer, maybe raccoons. When it was finally time to sleep, I climbed into my tent, zipped the flap closed, and lay on top of my sleeping bag. For a long time, I couldn't relax. I lay there staring at the thin fabric above me, listening. Every little sound seemed louder in the silence of the night. The distant call of some bird, the steady chirping of insects, and then, once in a while, the faint crack of something heavier moving across the forest floor. I told myself it was nothing. I tried to breathe slow, tried to calm down, but it felt like my ears were wide open, searching for something they didn't want to hear. At some point, I must have dozed off, because when I woke again the fire had burned out, and the tent was colder than before. The woods were completely silent now. That silence wasn't natural. It wasn't like the calm before. It was the kind of silence that makes your body tense without knowing why. I held my breath, listening, and then I heard it, slow steps in the leaves outside. They weren't heavy enough to sound like a bear or something that large, but they weren't quick or skittish like a small animal either. They were deliberate, slow, measured, like someone walking carefully just outside my tent. My heart started pounding. I stayed perfectly still, afraid to even move inside the sleeping bag. The steps moved around the clearing, slow crunches of leaves, pausing every so often. It was too steady to be an animal searching for food. It felt like someone was circling the tent. I didn't breathe until the sound faded, moving further into the trees. Even then, I couldn't relax. I lay awake the rest of the night, staring into the dark, waiting for something else to happen. When morning came, I was exhausted, but the sunlight made me feel safer. The forest didn't look as threatening in the day. I got up, checked around the clearing, and saw nothing unusual. The ground was covered in leaves and twigs, and though I thought I saw impressions where someone could have stepped, I couldn't be sure. I tried to tell myself I had imagined it, that it was probably just a deer. But the way it moved, the slow pacing, kept replaying in my head. I spent the day hiking further out, trying to shake the uneasy feeling. The woods were beautiful in the daylight, tall trees swaying, sunlight breaking through in patches, the smell of pine and earth strong in the air. I tried to enjoy it, but I couldn't get rid of the sense that I wasn't alone. Every time I stopped to drink water or sit for a moment, I felt like I should keep moving, like something was just out of sight watching. That night, I built a bigger fire, hoping it would make me feel safer. I cooked again, sat close to the flames, and forced myself to stay awake as long as I could. The forest sound seemed more normal this time, though every so often I thought I heard something faint, like a snap of a branch farther away. By midnight, My body was too tired to stay awake, so I climbed back into the tent. I hadn't been asleep for more than an hour when I woke again. This time it wasn't footsteps that woke me. It was the sound of breathing. Heavy, steady breathing right outside the tent. My blood froze. It was close, so close I thought for a moment it was inside with me. I could hear the faint rhythm of air pulling in and out, sometimes pausing, sometimes catching, like someone was trying to stay quiet but couldn't control their breath. I didn't move. I barely even let my chest rise and fall, trying to hide the sound of my own breathing. The fire outside had burned low again, so the tent was almost pitch black. I kept staring at the thin wall of fabric in front of me, waiting to see a shadow, a shape, anything. The breathing lasted for what felt like minutes, then slowly it moved away. I heard the faint crunch of steps retreating into the woods until it was silent again. I lay there shaking, unable to close my eyes. I didn't want to move, didn't want to make a sound. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn, every muscle in my body tight with fear. By morning, I was done. I didn't want to stay another night. I started packing my things as fast as I could, shoving gear into my bag, not even caring if I left things behind. The forest was quiet, but the quiet didn't feel safe anymore. It felt like the air was holding something back, waiting. I loaded everything, put out what was left of the fire, and started heading back to where I had parked. The trail felt longer than it had when I came in. Every sound behind me made me turn my head. Every bend in the path felt like something could be waiting just around it. I walked faster than I should have with the heavy pack, my legs burning, my breath quick and shallow. At one point, maybe halfway back, I stopped to rest for a second, leaning against a tree. That was when I noticed it. On the ground, pressed into the dirt, was a footprint. Not a boot like mine. Not the hoof of a deer or the paw of a coyote. It was the clear shape of a human shoe. And it was fresh. The edges were sharp, the soil still moist from where it had pressed down. It was facing the same direction I was going. I didn't stay to look at it longer. I forced myself to keep moving, faster now, almost running in parts of the trail, even with the heavy pack. The woods around me felt like they were closing in, every tree a place for someone to hide, every rustle in the leaves proof that I wasn't alone. When I finally saw the glint of my car through the trees, I nearly broke into a sprint. I dropped the pack into the back seat, climbed in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I didn't even look behind me as I pulled onto the road and drove away, just staring straight ahead, gripping the wheel so tight my fingers hurt. It wasn't until I was miles down the road, the forest far behind me, that I let myself breathe again. But even then, I couldn't shake the image of that footprint, the sound of those slow steps, and the heavy breathing outside my tent. It was clear now. I hadn't been out there alone. Someone had been in those woods with me, watching, moving around my camp, standing just outside while I tried to sleep. And the worst part was not knowing why they hadn't done anything more. Not knowing what they wanted. Not knowing if they had followed me all the way back to the car, standing just out of sight in the trees, watching me leave. I had gone there to find quiet, to get away from people. Instead, I found a kind of quiet I never wanted again. The quiet of knowing someone was out there with me, close enough to touch my tent in the dark, close enough to hear my breathing, and close enough that if I hadn't left when I did, I might not have left at all. I remember the night air feeling thick, heavy, almost suffocating even though it wasn't hot. The kind of air that presses against your skin and makes every breath feel just a little slower, a little harder. I had gone out there alone, choosing to camp by myself in a small clearing near a stretch of woods I didn't know too well. I had walked most of the afternoon, carrying my pack and taking in the silence of the trail until I came across the opening. It wasn't much, just a patch of grass surrounded by trees, with a faint path leading deeper into the woods on the far side. Something about it seemed quiet enough, isolated enough, that I figured it would do for the night. I laid my gear down, put up the tent, and started setting things in order. The sun was still dropping behind the trees, leaving that dim orange glow that stretches shadows long across the ground. I could hear a few birds somewhere in the distance, but otherwise it was mostly still. No cars, no voices, no buzzing of electricity. Just the muted sounds of the forest winding itself down for the night. At first it was calming. There's something about being away from everything that makes you feel like you can breathe a little deeper, even if the air feels heavier than normal. I gathered firewood just around the edges of the clearing, not wanting to go too far in. I noticed how quickly the forest swallowed light, the trees standing close enough together that the path between them turned into a black wall after only a few steps. I told myself I'd stay close until I had a proper fire going. It didn't take long before I had a decent pile of branches stacked beside the stones I had arranged in a ring. By the time I sparked it to life, the sun was nearly gone, and the flames leapt higher, casting a shifting circle of light around the clearing. The fire made the shadows seem alive. Every time I looked up, I caught myself glancing at the edges of the light, seeing shapes move where there was nothing, only the flickering of branches against the glow. I tried to ignore it, focusing on boiling some water for food. The sound of the fire crackling kept me company, but behind it, I started noticing other sounds. At first it was faint, like something brushing against leaves. Then it was the crunch of what might have been a footstep. Not close, but not far either. My head turned sharply, and the woods looked the same as they always had, dark, endless, silent except for the faint ringing in my ears. I tried to calm myself. Animals moved through the trees all the time. Deer, raccoons, foxes, anything could have made that noise. I forced myself to eat, even though every bite felt like chewing on stone. My stomach twisted as I swallowed, my eyes darting back to the tree line again and again. The firelight wasn't enough to push back the darkness far. The woods seemed thicker than they had during the day, as if they had crept closer while I wasn't looking. By the time I cleaned my small pot and set it aside, the sky had gone completely black. The stars above the clearing were sharp and cold, but they barely reached into the trees. I decided I'd sit up a while longer by the fire before going into the tent. My chair creaked as I leaned back, staring into the flames, trying to settle my nerves. That's when I heard it again. Not just one sound this time, but a rhythm. A slow, deliberate pacing. The crack of a branch breaking under weight. The dry swish of something brushing against another tree. I froze. My chest tightened, and I held my breath, straining to listen. The steps didn't come closer at first. They moved sideways, circling, dragging out the silence between each one. My mind scrambled for explanations. A bear? A large animal? But the way it moved, the careful spacing of the steps, it felt different. It felt purposeful, like it was aware of me, staying just far enough out of sight, but close enough that I couldn't ignore it. The fire popped loudly, and I jumped at the sound. The pacing stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but the crackling of the flames and the distant call of some night bird. I slowly reached down to my pack and pulled out the small hatchet I carried, setting it across my lap. The weight of it in my hands was both comforting and useless all at once. Minutes dragged by, each one longer than the last. I told myself I couldn't sit out there all night. I needed to go into the tent, zip it up, try to sleep, and let morning come. But the thought of turning my back on the tree line, of lying down blind while something, or someone moved out there, filled me with a dread that seemed to stick in my throat. Finally, I forced myself to stand. The firelight danced across the grass, and my shadow stretched out long behind me. I kept the hatchet in my hand as I backed toward the tent. Every step made the fabric of the tent look smaller, weaker, like nothing more than paper between me and the dark. When I finally ducked inside, I zipped it up fast, heart pounding in my ears. Inside, the air was stuffy and close. I laid down on my sleeping bag, the hatchet still clutched tightly. I tried to breathe slowly, tried to calm myself, but every sound outside seemed magnified through the thin fabric. Leaves brushing, twigs snapping, and then, unmistakably, footsteps again. Closer this time. I held my breath. The fire outside crackled faintly, its glow pushing just enough light through the tent walls to keep the space from being fully black. Shadows shifted as the flames flickered, and in that unsteady glow, I could see movement just outside. A figure moved past, slow, steady, blocking the firelight for an instant as it crossed between me and the flames. My body went cold. My fingers dug tighter into the handle of the hatchet. Whoever it was didn't stop. They walked past, their shapes stretching and shrinking as the fire danced. I waited, counting each second in my head, feeling sweat slide down the sides of my face. After a while, the sound faded, swallowed by the woods again. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I laid there in the dark for hours, every muscle tight, every nerve on edge, waiting for the sound to return. The fire outside burned low, the glow fading, until only faint embers lit the clearing. At some point, exhaustion must have taken me, because the next thing I knew, A thin light was spilling across the fabric of the tent. Morning. When I unzipped the tent, the air outside was cool and damp. The fire was nothing more than ash and a few charred pieces of wood. My gear was untouched, just as I had left it, but the ground around the clearing was not. There were prints. Not animal tracks, not random scuffs. Footprints. Bare, human footprints pressed into the dirt, circling the camp, weaving between trees, and stopping just a few feet from my tent before turning away. The weight of that realization sank into me. Someone had been out there all night, watching, circling, waiting. I packed my gear as quickly as I could, my hands shaking so badly that I dropped things more than once. I didn't bother to eat or even drink. I just shoved everything into my bag, kicked dirt over the ashes of the fire, and left. The trail back out felt longer than it had coming in. Every sound made me flinch. Every step felt like I was being followed. I didn't stop to rest, didn't look back until I reached the edge of the road where I had left my car. Only then did I allow myself to breathe fully again. Even now, when I think back on that night, I can feel the same tightness in my chest. It wasn't the woods that scared me, not the darkness, not the fire dying out. It was the knowledge that someone else had chosen to be out there too. Not camping, not hiking, not passing by. They had been there for me, circling me like a predator, watching me sit by the fire, watching me lie inside the tent, close enough to reach out if they wanted to. I never went back to that clearing. I never even looked for it again. The memory of those footprints was enough. I remember the way the air felt that evening, heavy and damp, the kind of air that presses on your chest without you noticing until you try to breathe deeply. I had decided to spend a weekend by myself at a small cabin tucked away at the edge of the woods. It wasn't really far from town, maybe a 40-minute drive, but once you got there it felt like another world. The dirt road leading in was narrow, with tree branches hanging low and scraping along the side of my car as I drove. The cabin itself was nothing fancy, just 4 wooden walls, a porch with a single chair, and an old wood stove inside. I had brought supplies with me: food, water, a lantern, a flashlight, a small axe for cutting wood, and a sleeping bag. I wanted to clear my head, to step away from everything. I thought being alone would make me feel lighter, calmer. For the first few hours, it did. I walked the edges of the clearing, noticing the silence except for the constant hum of insects. The forest loomed on all sides, dark and crowded with trees that seemed to lean inward, watching. When the sun began to drop, the clearing shifted. The light bled out of the sky and shadows stretched until they blended into the wall of trees. I built a small fire in the ring of stones beside the cabin, using what I'd brought with me. The fire crackled, sparks shooting upward, but the darkness around me seemed thicker than what I was used to. Every time I looked into the forest, I felt like something would be there if I stared long enough. I tried to distract myself by making food. I heated a can of soup on the fire and ate straight from it, the metal warm in my hands. I kept glancing toward the tree line, feeling that uncomfortable prickle on the back of my neck. The longer I sat outside, the more aware I became of how alone I really was. There was no cell service this far out. If anything happened, I would have to deal with it myself. It was around 9 when I heard the first sound that didn't belong to the usual forest background. It was faint at first, a steady rustle of movement. Not the random scatter of a squirrel, not the quick burst of a rabbit darting through underbrush, but a slow and steady push of something moving deliberately. I froze, spoon halfway to my mouth. My eyes fixed on the line where firelight ended and the forest began. The noise stopped the moment I tried to focus on it. I stayed by the fire a while longer, listening. The insects had gone quiet. It was strange how heavy the silence became when even the crickets refused to fill it. My ears strained for anything, and finally, I heard it again. This time it was clearer. The sound of weight shifting on leaves, something stepping carefully, but still heavy enough that it couldn't disguise itself completely. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe even a stray dog, but the thought didn't calm me. I stayed by the fire until the wood began to burn down. Then I reluctantly went inside the cabin. I closed the wooden door, set the latch, and lit the lantern on the small table. The light flickered against the log walls, making the whole cabin feel smaller, almost suffocating. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening. For a while, all I heard was my own breathing and the occasional creak of the old cabin settling. I almost managed to drift off when a new sound pulled me back to full awareness. It was soft at first, like something brushing lightly against wood. Then it came again, louder, a clear drag of something along the outer wall of the cabin. My heart thumped hard. I lay perfectly still, staring at the ceiling, holding my breath to listen. The noise circled the cabin slowly. It wasn't quick or frantic. It moved with patience, dragging, then pausing, then dragging again. I imagined an animal rubbing against the wood, but it didn't sound right. The pauses between movements felt too controlled, too intentional. I sat up, my body tense. I reached for the flashlight, my hand shaking as I clicked it on. The beam cut across the cabin, bright but unsteady. I thought about going to the window, but fear pinned me in place. Instead, I stayed where I was, my ears straining, the sound of dragging wood still circling. Eventually, after what felt like forever, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I barely slept that night. Every small creak, every rustle outside made my pulse jump. I stayed alert until exhaustion finally pulled me into shallow sleep. When morning came, I stepped outside cautiously. The fire pit was cold, and the clearing was damp with dew. I walked slowly around the cabin, scanning the dirt for prints. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Then near the back wall, I noticed disturbed leaves and a faint impression in the soil. It wasn't a clear footprint, but it wasn't random either. Something had been there, close to the wall, close to where I had heard the dragging. I tried to shake it off. I told myself it could have been an animal pressing against the cabin in the night. Still, the uneasy feeling stayed with me. I spent the day gathering more firewood, keeping busy. I avoided the forest, sticking close to the clearing. Every so often, I caught myself glancing at the trees, expecting movement. By the time night came again, my nerves were already worn thin. I built a larger fire, adding extra logs, hoping it would keep whatever was out there away. I sat closer to it this time, watching the flames. The night closed in fast. Soon the forest was nothing but a black wall surrounding the clearing. It didn't take long before I heard it again. This time it wasn't rustling in the leaves. It was the clear crunch of footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps, not far from the edge of the firelight. I froze, my eyes locked on the darkness. The sound stopped. My skin crawled with the awareness that someone, or something, was just outside my sight. The fire popped, sparks flying, and in that brief light I thought I saw movement between the trees. A shape, tall and still, half hidden in the shadows. My throat tightened. I told myself not to blink, not to move. But when the flames settled, the shape was gone. I stayed outside longer than I should have, trying to convince myself I imagined it. But the footsteps started again, circling wide around the clearing. My fear finally pushed me inside. I shut the door hard, latched it, and pulled the lantern closer. I sat in the chair by the table, gripping the flashlight, staring at the door. The dragging sound returned. It moved slowly along the walls, then paused. The silence was so heavy I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. Then came the sound of weight pressing lightly against the wooden boards, as if something, or someone, was leaning against the wall, testing it. I stayed awake the entire night, too afraid to close my eyes. When morning light finally crept through the window, I went outside again. This time, the marks were clearer. Not animal prints, but impressions too large and spaced too evenly to be anything but human. They circled the cabin, stopping at the door, then continuing. That was the moment I decided I wouldn't stay another night. I packed quickly, stuffing my things into bags without caring about the order. My hands shook as I carried everything to the car. The whole time I felt eyes on me, as if the trees were hiding something that refused to step into the daylight. When I finally drove away, the dirt road felt endless. Every glance in the rearview mirror showed only dust rising behind me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that if I slowed down, I would see someone standing there at the edge of the road, watching me leave. Even now, when I think back to that weekend, I remind myself there were no ghosts, no monsters. It was something real, something human, and that makes it worse. Someone had been out there, circling the cabin, watching me in the dark, and I'll never know why. I never thought that one simple decision could leave me shaken for the rest of my life. Looking back, it almost feels like it was something waiting for me, like it didn't matter what I chose, I would have ended up there anyway. But the truth is, I chose to go. I chose to step into that moment, into that place, and I learned just how quickly a normal night can turn into something terrifying. It was late summer, the air still heavy and warm, but already hinting at the coming fall. The days had been hot, and the nights cooled down just enough to make sitting outside feel comfortable. I had driven out to a small wooded area just outside of town, a place I liked because it was quiet. People rarely went there, and even fewer stayed after dark. The spot wasn't official parkland, just some old trails cut by hunters and kids looking for a place to drink. There was a clearing in the middle of the woods that I had found a couple months before, and it became a place where I could go and be alone. That night, I packed a small backpack with a flashlight, some water, and a folding chair. I parked my car on the gravel pull-off by the road and followed the narrow path into the trees. It was about a 15-minute walk to the clearing, and as I went, the sounds of the world behind me faded. No cars, no houses, no voices. Just the forest, with its mixture of insects buzzing, leaves rustling, and the occasional sharp crack of a branch snapping somewhere in the distance. I always tried not to think too much about those noises, because if you thought too hard about them, your mind would start inventing reasons for them. Every small sound could turn into footsteps. Every shadow could hide something waiting. I told myself it was just raccoons or deer, maybe even a stray dog moving around. Still, I kept my flashlight in hand, thumb on the switch, ready to snap it on if I had to. The clearing opened up suddenly, a wide circle where the trees stopped and the grass grew waist-high in some places. I had flattened down a small area for my chair and kept a few stones around from when I had once made a small fire pit. I set the chair down, sat, and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Out there, under the open sky, I always felt both exposed and safe at the same time. Exposed, because there was nothing shielding me from the woods that pressed in all around. Safe, because I could see the tree line in every direction, nothing close enough to sneak up without me noticing. The first hour passed quietly. I listened to the insects, the soft breeze moving through the grass, and the occasional night bird calling from the trees. My phone stayed in my pocket, and I just let the dark settle around me. But after a while, something shifted. I didn't notice it at first. It wasn't sudden, like a loud noise or movement. It was more subtle. I realized that I was leaning forward in the chair, listening harder than before. My eyes kept drifting to the right, toward the far edge of the clearing. At first, I thought I was imagining it. A darker shape among the trees, something that didn't quite match the pattern of branches and shadows. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and told myself it was just my brain adjusting to the dim light. But the longer I stared, the more I felt sure that something, or someone, was standing there, just inside the tree line. I stayed frozen, my hand on the flashlight, but I didn't turn it on yet. I wanted my eyes to stay adjusted to the dark, because the beam of light might blind me for a few seconds when I turned it off again. I tried to focus on the spot, waiting for movement, but nothing happened. After a couple minutes, I convinced myself I was wrong. My mind had just built a shape out of the shadows, the way it does when you stare too long at the dark. I sat back again, but I didn't feel relaxed anymore. The quiet felt heavier now. I realized I couldn't hear any of the night insects that had been buzzing so loud before. The air felt still, like even the breeze had gone. I told myself that sometimes it happened, that the forest had its own rhythms. But my skin prickled, and my stomach twisted. I felt like the whole clearing was holding its breath, waiting for something. Then came the sound. It wasn't loud, but in the silence it felt sharp, cutting straight through everything. A footstep. Not the random snap of a branch from an animal, not the soft scurry of a raccoon. It was heavy, deliberate, and it came from the tree line to my right, the same spot where I thought I had seen the shape. My hand tightened around the flashlight. I turned it on, the beam slicing through the dark, flooding the grass and hitting the trees. For a second, all I saw were trunks, branches, and shadows. Then the beam caught movement. A shape shifted, pulling back, just out of reach of the light. I jerked the beam toward it, but whatever it was had already moved deeper into the trees. My chest tightened, and I could feel the pounding of my heart in my ears. I stood slowly, sweeping the light back and forth along the tree line. Nothing, just the still, waiting forest. I told myself it was an animal, but the sound had been too heavy, too human. I debated packing up right then and leaving, but a part of me didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to accept that someone else had been standing there, watching me. I waited, holding the light steady on the trees, but the forest stayed still. Finally, I shut it off, plunging the clearing back into darkness. My eyes adjusted slowly, and I sat back in the chair, trying to steady my breathing. For a while, nothing happened. My muscles started to loosen, and I almost convinced myself I had overreacted. But then I heard it again. Not from the right this time, but from directly across the clearing. Another footstep, slow, heavy, pressing into the ground. I stood up fast, swinging the flashlight across the clearing. My heart hammered in my chest as the beam lit up the opposite tree line. Again, I caught the faintest flicker of movement, something slipping back behind the cover of the trees, staying just out of full sight. That was enough. I shoved the chair down, grabbed my bag, and started for the path. My flashlight beam shook with my hands as I walked quickly, then faster, until I was nearly jogging. Every few steps, I swung the light behind me, half expecting to see someone following. Nothing, just the endless dark of the forest. The path twisted, and every shadow seemed to move. My breath came hard, and my skin was slick with sweat despite the cool night air. I kept telling myself not to run, that running would make me trip, but my body didn't care. By the time I saw the faint glint of my car through the trees, I was sprinting. I broke out of the woods, nearly throwing myself into the driver's side. I yanked the door open, tossed the bag inside, and slammed it shut behind me. My shaking hands fumbled the keys, and I dropped them once before jamming them into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I threw the car into reverse, tires spitting gravel as I turned back onto the road. As I drove, I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see headlights behind me, or worse, someone standing in the road. But the night stayed empty. It wasn't until I was halfway home that I let myself breathe again. My body ached with the release of tension, my hands cramping from how tightly I had been gripping the wheel. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a long time, the engine off, the world silent. My mind kept replaying the sound of those footsteps, the way the shape slipped just out of sight. Whoever it was, they hadn't called out, hadn't made a sound except for those slow, deliberate steps. They had just watched, waited, and moved along the edge of the clearing, staying in the dark where I couldn't see them. That was the part that stayed with me the most. Not the fear I felt, not the sprint back to the car. It was the knowledge that I had been out there alone, sitting in the open, while someone else had been in the trees, watching me, circling me. And they had never tried to leave the shadows. They wanted me to know they were there, without ever letting me see them fully. I never went back to that clearing again. Even now, when I drive past that stretch of woods, I feel the same tightness in my chest, the same prickle on my skin. I tell myself it was just someone passing through, maybe a hunter or another camper. But deep down, I know it wasn't that simple. Because if it was, why didn't they ever step out into the light? Why didn't they say a word? Why did they stay hidden, circling, waiting, until I finally fled? And why, even now, do I sometimes feel the same sensation I felt that night? The weight of unseen eyes on me, watching from just beyond the edge of the light. It was late in the afternoon when I decided to head out for a drive into the hills. I had been restless all week, stuck between work and a routine that felt like it was pressing down on me. So I thought maybe getting out of the house and away from the noise of the city would help clear my head. The highway stretched out long and empty, and the further I went the more the buildings fell away until it was only fields, patches of woods, and the gray outline of hills in the distance. The air felt cooler, sharper, and the silence that came with leaving the city behind made me feel like I could finally breathe again. The road I chose wasn't one I had ever been on before. It wasn't a main road, more like a narrow county road that wound through farmland and then cut into the hills. The asphalt was cracked in places, weeds growing through the edges, and I only passed one other car in nearly an hour of driving. I wasn't worried about getting lost since my phone still had signal, and I liked the idea of just following the road until I got tired of it. As the sun dropped lower, the light spilled across the hills in deep orange streaks. The woods got thicker, stretching on both sides of the road until the trees grew so close together they blocked most of the sky. I slowed down to take it all in, rolling down the windows to hear the cicadas and the distant sound of water somewhere deeper in the woods. I wasn't in a hurry, and for the first time in weeks I felt calm. But calm never lasts long. I noticed the first odd thing about 30 minutes later, when I came to a curve in the road where an old wooden fence lined the side. Just past the fence, tucked between the trees, there was what looked like the remains of a burned-out truck. The metal frame was twisted, charred black, and the tires had long since rotted off. It wasn't fresh, it must have been sitting there for years, but it struck me how strange it was that no one had cleared it away. I slowed down and looked at it as I passed, my eyes catching on the sharp edges of metal and the melted glass. For some reason it gave me a strange feeling, like I shouldn't linger too long. I pressed down on the gas and moved on. The road narrowed the further I went, so narrow that if another car had come the other way, I wasn't sure how we'd both fit. The trees leaned over the road in a way that made it feel like a tunnel, the branches reaching and tangling together above me. I glanced at my phone and realized the signal had dropped to nothing. I wasn't worried yet, but it made me feel like I was really out there, far from anyone else. The second strange thing happened just before dusk. I saw someone walking along the road ahead of me. At first I thought it was just a hiker or maybe someone from a nearby house. But as I got closer, I realized there weren't any houses, no driveways, no trails marked anywhere near where they were. They were just walking slowly, straight down the middle of the road. I slowed the car to match their pace, but before I got too close, they stepped off into the woods without looking back, disappearing between the trees. I looked to the spot where they'd gone, but the woods swallowed them almost instantly. No sound, no movement, just gone. I drove past the spot and looked into the trees, but there was nothing. No path, no sign anyone had been there. The sun had dropped lower by then, shadows growing long and stretching over the road, and the woods seemed darker than they should have been. I shook it off and told myself it was nothing, just someone out here who knew the place better than I did. Night came fast. Out here there weren't any streetlights, no glow from nearby towns, only the headlights cutting through the dark. The woods pressed in closer, and I felt like I was driving deeper into some place I wasn't supposed to be. I started to think maybe I should turn around, but the road was so narrow I would have had to back up a long way to find a spot wide enough to do it safely. I decided I'd keep going a little longer, hoping it would eventually open up. That was when I saw the car. It was parked on the side of the road, half on the gravel shoulder and half in the weeds. At first glance it looked abandoned. The windows were fogged over, and the paint was dull with dust. But what made me slow down was the driver's door. It was wide open, not just cracked, but all the way open, as if whoever had been in it had left in a hurry. I pulled up slowly, my headlights washing over the car. It was an older model sedan, maybe from the late 90s, and there were no plates on it. Inside, I could see clutter on the seats, fast food wrappers, an old jacket, something metallic in the cup holder, but no sign of anyone. I stopped for a moment, engine idling, staring at that open door. The woods around me were silent, too silent. Not even the cicadas now. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Something about it wasn't right, and I didn't want to sit there long enough to find out why. I eased past it, my eyes locked on the rearview mirror until the car disappeared into the dark behind me. I thought about turning around again. I thought about how strange it all felt, how the road seemed endless, how there was no sign of houses or other cars. But I kept going, telling myself I was overthinking it. Then I saw the figure again. Up ahead, maybe 50 yards down the road, someone was standing just off the shoulder, half hidden by the trees. Not walking this time, just standing. I slowed down, my grip tightening on the wheel. The headlights caught them only for a second before the curve of the road shifted, and they slipped back into the shadows. My chest felt tight. I pressed harder on the gas, telling myself I just wanted to get out of there faster, but my hands were shaking on the wheel. I kept glancing into the woods, every shadow looking like it could move, every gap between the trees feeling like a doorway. I drove for what felt like hours, though it couldn't have been more than 30 minutes. The woods didn't thin, the road didn't widen, and my phone stayed dead. My fuel gauge dipped lower than I was comfortable with. I started to wonder if the road ever ended, if I had somehow gotten myself onto some forgotten stretch of asphalt that just wound through the hills forever. When I came to the clearing, I almost didn't believe it at first. The trees broke apart suddenly, the road opening into a wide dirt lot that looked like an old rest area. There were cracked picnic tables, a rusted metal trash barrel, and a wooden sign so faded I couldn't make out what it once said. I pulled over and shut off the engine, the sudden silence pressing in heavy and thick. That was when I heard it. Movement. Not loud, but enough. Leaves shifting, a branch snapping somewhere just beyond the tree line. I sat frozen in the driver's seat, my eyes locked on the dark woods. The sound came again, closer this time, the unmistakable rhythm of footsteps moving slowly across the ground. Not an animal. Too heavy. Too deliberate. I turned the key and the engine sputtered back to life. but in that moment I caught sight of something in the headlights. A shape, just for a second. Tall, still, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching. I didn't wait to see more. I slammed the car into gear and tore out of there, the tires kicking up dirt as I swung back onto the road. I didn't stop again. Not for the woods, not for the shadows, not even when I thought I saw movement pacing me between the trees. I kept driving, hands locked on the wheel, my eyes fixed on the narrow strip of asphalt illuminated in front of me. It felt endless, the road twisting and curling deeper into the dark, until finally, after what must have been another hour, I saw lights. They weren't headlights. They were streetlights. Faint at first, then brighter as the road widened and spit me out into a small town I had never heard of. Just like that, the woods were gone, the silence broken by the hum of neon signs and the sound of cars parked along the curb. I pulled into a gas station and shut off the car, my body shaking so hard I could barely keep the keys in my hand. I sat there for a long time, staring at the bright lights of the station, listening to the familiar noise of traffic on a nearby road, trying to calm myself down. When I finally stepped out, the air smelled of gasoline and fried food from the diner next door. It felt real again, normal again, and yet I couldn't shake the weight pressing in my chest. I didn't know what I had seen back there, or why the road felt the way it did, but I knew I never wanted to drive it again. I filled my tank, got back in the car, and pulled onto the main highway, heading home. But even as the miles rolled away, even as the city lights grew closer, I couldn't stop checking the mirrors. Every shadow that flickered past made my heart pound. Every glimpse of dark woods along the roadside made me grip the wheel tighter. I told myself I had made it out, that it was over, but some part of me couldn't believe it. Some part of me felt like the road hadn't really let me go. Like somewhere out there, in the dark hills and the endless woods, someone was still standing just beyond the trees, waiting for me to come back. I never really thought about how silence could turn against you until that night. I used to believe that silence was something calming, something that gave peace and rest. But when you're alone in the wrong place, when your body is tired and your nerves are stretched thin, silence becomes something else entirely. It presses against you, it rings in your ears, and every little sound that breaks through it feels like a warning. That was the way it felt to me when I decided to stay alone in that small hunting cabin deep in the woods. The cabin belonged to a friend of my father's. He used it in the fall for deer season and sometimes in winter when he wanted to trap, but for most of the year, it just sat there collecting dust. He let me use it for a weekend when I asked, since I said I wanted a break from people and noise. At the time, I meant it. I thought being cut off would be good for me. No phone service, no neighbors, no cars passing by. Just me, a small wood stove, a kerosene lantern, and my own thoughts. I parked my car at the end of the logging road and hiked the last mile in, carrying a pack with food and a few supplies. The woods were heavy and green that time of year. The air had that damp smell of soil and leaves breaking down. The trail wasn't really a trail, more like an overgrown path with brambles scratching against my legs. When I reached the cabin, the first thing I noticed was how small it looked compared to what I'd pictured in my head. Just one room, a sloped tin roof, and a crooked chimney. The porch sagged, and the windows were smudged with dirt. Inside, it was basic but fine. A cot against one wall, a little wooden table with 2 chairs, a shelf with some cans left behind, and the old stove with a pile of split wood stacked beside it. The floor creaked when I walked across, and there was a smell of dust and something a little sour, like damp clothes. But I liked it. It felt simple, quiet, safe. At least, that's how it felt in the daylight. By evening I had the stove going, a small fire crackling inside, and I cooked myself some canned soup. The sun went down quicker than I expected, the wood swallowing up the light until the only glow came from the fire and the lantern. The air outside was dead still. No breeze, no rustling leaves. When I stepped out onto the porch to breathe the cool air, it was like stepping into a wall of black. The trees pressed close, and the night swallowed everything beyond a few steps. I could barely see the outline of the path I had walked in on. That was the first time I felt it, the unease. Like standing too close to the edge of a drop you can't see the bottom of. I sat inside and tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just not used to this kind of darkness. I read a book I brought along, sipped water, and stretched out on the cot. I must have dozed off because I woke up some time later with the lantern out and the fire almost dead. The room was pitch black except for the faint orange glow inside the stove. I lay there still, adjusting to the quiet. That was when I heard it, something outside. A crunch, not loud, but sharp enough to cut through the silence. It sounded like a boot on leaves. I froze. My ears strained for more, but nothing came right away. Then a little shift. Another crunch. This time it was closer. My chest tightened, and I sat up slowly on the cot. My first thought was that it could be an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon. But the way the steps came, spaced out and heavy, made me think otherwise. They weren't random scurries. They were deliberate. I held my breath and counted the seconds between them. 1, 2, 3, another crunch. Whoever or whatever it was, they were walking slowly around the cabin. I stayed still, every muscle tight, listening as the sound circled. At one point it stopped right outside the wall near my head. I could hear the faint shift of weight, like someone trying to stand quietly. The silence stretched on and on, until I almost thought I had imagined it. But then the crunching started again, this time moving toward the back of the cabin. I wanted to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe a hunter passing through, maybe just a deer. But I couldn't shake the thought of how slow the steps were, how purposeful. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. They were moving like they had all the time in the world. I stayed awake for hours, clutching the flashlight I had beside me, until eventually exhaustion dragged me under. The next morning, I tried to brush it off. The light of day made it easier. I stepped outside and walked around the cabin, looking for tracks. The ground was mostly leaves, but here and there I saw depressions, long, narrow, like the shape of boots. They trailed off into the trees. My stomach turned, but I forced myself to believe it could have been from earlier. Maybe even my own, though they didn't line up exactly. I spent the day hiking a little, gathering more wood, trying to keep my mind busy. But all day, I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods weren't empty. Every time I stopped, I thought I heard something faint behind me. A twig snap, the sound of something brushing against branches. When I turned, there was nothing, just the endless green of the trees. That night was worse, much worse. The fire was burning steady, the lantern dimmed, and I had just started to drift off when it came again. The crunching, at first far off, then closer, slow, steady, circling. My mouth went dry. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. This time I knew it wasn't an animal. There was rhythm in those steps, a weight behind them. Human weight. I gripped the flashlight again, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to give away that I was awake. The steps drew closer, circling tighter around the cabin, stopping now and then. At one point I heard something scrape lightly against the wall. A dragging sound, like fingers or the tip of something hard. I pressed my back against the wall of the cot and stayed there, barely breathing. Hours seemed to crawl by before the sound faded. I don't know when I finally drifted off, but when I woke up, the light coming through the window was weak and gray. I stepped outside again. This time, the ground told more of a story. Clear boot prints, fresh, leading from the trees right up to the cabin walls and back out again. My chest went hollow. Someone had been right there in the night, circling me while I lay inside. I wanted to pack up and leave, but part of me felt stubborn. I told myself maybe it was just some local messing around. If I left, it would feel like running. So I stayed, even though my gut screamed at me not to. That evening, I forced myself to stay awake. I kept the lantern low, the fire burning small, and sat at the table with my ears tuned to every sound. The woods outside were dead quiet. Too quiet. I waited for hours, the air heavy, my nerves stretched thin. Then, sometime deep into the night, I heard it again. Not just crunching this time, but something more. The sound of weight shifting on the porch boards. A slow creak. My throat tightened. The porch was only a few steps from where I sat. I could picture the shape of the door, the thin wood between me and whoever stood there. Another creak followed, closer. I held the flashlight tight in my hand, ready to shine it, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Then came the faintest sound of breath, just on the other side of the door. Long, slow breaths. Someone was standing there, listening. Minutes stretched like hours. My hands shook, but I stayed frozen, waiting. Finally, the boards creaked again, this time moving away. The steps faded into the trees, and eventually the silence returned. By the time the first pale light of morning came, I had already decided. I packed my bag, shoved everything I could inside, and left. I didn't bother putting the fire out. I didn't bother looking for tracks. I just walked. I walked fast, almost running, down the path, not looking back. The woods felt alive all around me, like eyes followed me through every step. When I finally reached my car, my hands shook so badly I fumbled with the keys. I got in, slammed the doors shut, and started the engine. Only then did I let myself breathe fully again. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I never told anyone the full details. I said I just didn't like being alone out there, that it wasn't for me. But the truth was clear in my head. Someone had been out there those nights. Not an animal, not a trick of my imagination. Someone had stood outside that cabin, circling, watching, breathing through the walls. I don't know what they wanted. I don't know why they never tried the door. But I know this. If I had stayed one more night, if I had let myself fall asleep again with those sounds just outside, I might not have made it out. Even now, when the world goes quiet and I hear the faintest creak of wood or the crunch of steps outside my window, my chest tightens the same way. Because I remember the weight of those slow, deliberate footsteps, circling in the dark, waiting for me to slip. It was late in the summer when I decided to spend a few days alone in the woods. I had been working nonstop for months, and my mind was restless. I thought a trip out into nature would calm me down, help me clear my head, and let me feel something different from the constant noise of daily life. I packed my gear slowly and carefully the night before: tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, food for a few days, a knife, some rope, a flashlight, spare batteries, and enough water to last until I could refill from the stream I knew ran through the valley. I felt proud of myself for being so prepared. The drive out took nearly 3 hours, and I could feel the city fading away behind me as the roads narrowed and the trees thickened around the asphalt. The air grew heavier with the smell of pine and damp earth. By the time I parked my car near the gravel trailhead, there was barely anyone around. A single truck stood in the lot, old and faded, and its owner was nowhere in sight. That gave me a strange feeling, knowing someone else was out here, but not knowing where. Still, I brushed it off. People came out here to camp and hike all the time. The trail started wide, worn down by years of use, but after half an hour of walking it narrowed into a path lined with roots and rocks. My pack was heavy, sweat rolled down my back, and insects buzzed around my face. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became. At first, I welcomed the silence, but soon it began to feel thick, as if the trees themselves were pressing closer around me, cutting me off from the world I had left behind. By late afternoon, I reached the small clearing I had planned to camp in. It was a flat patch of earth, a good 100 feet from the stream, with tall trees on every side. The grass was short and dry, and it looked like others had camped there before. I dropped my pack, stretched my sore shoulders, and set up the tent. I felt a little thrill at the thought of being alone out here. Nobody to bother me, no responsibilities, just me, the woods, and the long, quiet nights. After the tent was up, I gathered some branches and started a small fire. I sat with my knees pulled up, listening to the crackle and the occasional snap as sap boiled out of the wood. The shadows grew long and stretched out across the clearing, and the forest shifted with the evening. Birds grew silent. The wind faded. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for the night. When darkness finally settled in, it came fast. I cooked a simple meal on the fire and ate slowly, looking into the trees. The light from the flames only reached so far, and past that point everything was swallowed in blackness. I tried to look away, but I kept finding my eyes drawn back to the dark. Every now and then, I thought I saw a movement between the trunks, a flicker, a shift, something sliding across the edge of my vision. I told myself it was just my eyes playing tricks. I slept poorly that night. The ground was hard, and the noises of the forest kept dragging me out of shallow dreams. I heard rustling, heavy steps that stopped as soon as I raised my head. My heart pounded every time. At one point, I was sure I heard breathing just beyond the thin nylon wall of my tent. Slow, steady, almost human. I held my breath, clutching the knife I had left beside me, until finally the sound faded. I lay awake for hours after, staring at the roof of the tent until the sky lightened. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease. I walked down to the stream, knelt at the edge, and cupped water into my mouth. It was ice cold, and the shock of it helped wake me. I filled my bottles and washed my face, but I couldn't ignore the faint prints I noticed in the mud. They weren't animal prints. They looked like boots. Fresh ones, pressed deep into the wet earth. They weren't mine. I could see my own prints, lighter, leading in a different direction. These ones followed the stream, and they were new enough that water hadn't filled them yet. I told myself maybe they belonged to the man with the truck, but something about them didn't sit right with me. They were close to my camp, too close. I spent the day hiking further into the woods, trying to distract myself. The forest was endless. Every direction looked the same: tall trees, damp earth, fallen logs, and thick undergrowth. My feet ached, and sweat drenched my shirt. By late afternoon, I returned to camp, worn out. The fire pit was as I had left it, the tent still standing. But something was different. My pack had shifted. I had left it leaning against a tree, but now it was on its side, lying in the dirt. I felt my stomach drop. I knelt, opening it carefully, checking everything. Nothing was missing, but things had been moved. My food bag was at the bottom when I had left it on top. My flashlight was turned sideways. Someone had gone through my things. The sun was dropping fast, shadows swallowing the clearing. I tried to steady my hands as I lit the fire again. I sat close to it, watching the dark beyond the trees, my knife resting on my thigh. Hours dragged by. The fire burned low, and I added wood slowly, careful not to let it die out. My ears strained for every sound. The snap of a twig, the shift of leaves, the faint crunch of footsteps that seemed too deliberate to belong to animals. At some point deep in the night, I saw it. Movement at the edge of the firelight. A shape, tall, thin, standing between the trees. It didn't move closer. It didn't speak. It just stood there. My chest tightened, and I could feel the blood rushing in my ears. I gripped the knife so hard my knuckles ached. I blinked, and it was gone. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every time I thought I heard something, I sat up, listening, heart racing. The hours were endless. When dawn came, I packed fast. I stuffed everything into my pack without caring about order. I wanted out. My skin crawled with the feeling of being watched. I stamped out the fire and headed back toward the trail. My steps were quick, too quick, and I kept glancing over my shoulder. 2 miles in, I found something that made me stop cold. A tree near the path had a mark cut into the bark. A long slash, fresh, pale wood exposed beneath. Below it, pressed into the mud, were boot prints. The same as before, pointed toward me, following me. My breath caught. I hurried on, legs burning, throat dry. Every step felt heavier. The forest no longer felt like trees and air and dirt. It felt like walls closing in, like eyes all around me. The silence wasn't empty. It was thick, waiting. By the time I reached the parking lot, I was drenched in sweat and shaking. My car was there, untouched. The old truck was gone. I unlocked the door with trembling hands, shoved my pack inside, and started the engine. Gravel spat from under my tires as I pulled away. The road wound back through the trees, and I didn't let myself slow down until the forest finally thinned and the sky opened wide above me. I kept looking into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a figure in the middle of the road, standing and watching. I never went back to those woods. Even now, when I think about it, I don't remember the quiet of nature or the beauty of the trees. I only remember the feeling of being followed, of someone standing just out of sight, waiting for the moment I let my guard down. I still don't know who it was or what they wanted, but I know one thing clearly. If I had stayed even one more night, I might not have come back at all. I never thought much about being alone in the woods. I had camped before, hiked plenty of trails, and even spent nights in cabins far from towns or roads, but there was always someone else nearby. This time was different. I wanted to test myself, to see if I could handle being fully alone in a remote place for a few days. It wasn't supposed to be about fear, more about peace and self-reliance. But what happened changed the way I think about being out there. I drove out early in the morning, hours down winding rural roads, passing through small towns that looked half forgotten. The kind of places with peeling paint on old stores, gas stations with one pump, and maybe a diner with 2 cars parked outside. The further I went, the less I saw. By the time I left the last stretch of cracked pavement and turned onto a narrow dirt road, I knew I was heading into real isolation. Dust followed me in the rearview mirror, hanging in the air before drifting into the trees. The road cut deep into the forest, pines and oaks leaning over, branches stretching almost a touch above the hood of my car. It was quiet enough that when I rolled down the window, I could hear insects buzzing and the distant cry of a bird. No traffic, no people, just the crunch of tires on gravel and the occasional jolt when I hit a rut. After about 20 minutes, the road widened into a rough clearing near a stream. That was where I planned to set up camp. I unpacked slow, taking my time. The sun was still high, a sharp white light filtering through the trees, making everything look alive with movement. I pitched my tent near the tree line, close to where the ground dipped slightly toward the water. The stream wasn't wide, but it had clear, moving water that would be good for cooking and cleaning. I gathered some fallen wood, stacked it neat, and set up a small fire ring with stones. It felt good, methodical, like the kind of routine that kept your mind calm. The afternoon passed with me walking the area, making mental notes of landmarks, listening to the forest's rhythm. The smell of pine needles under the sun, the way the air cooled slightly in the shade, the small rustlings of unseen creatures moving in the brush. It was peaceful. I cooked a simple meal, ate slow, and as the sun sank, I sat by the fire and listened. Darkness in a place like that doesn't come gradual. It feels like a sudden weight, shadows stretching long until they become the ground itself. I told myself it was fine. I'd seen dark woods before. I laid down in the tent, zipped the flap, and listened to the stream. But that night I didn't sleep much. Every small sound seemed louder. A snap of a twig somewhere to the left. The faint shuffle of something in the undergrowth. My mind pictured deer, maybe raccoons, but part of me stayed alert, ears straining in the dark. Morning brought relief. The sun spilled gold across the clearing, and the night's unease felt almost foolish. I brewed coffee over the fire, ate breakfast, and hiked deeper into the woods. The trail wasn't marked, but I followed a ridge that gave me a good view of rolling hills thick with trees. It was beautiful in that raw way, untouched and endless. I walked for hours, turned back when the light began to fade, and reached camp tired but calm. That second night, though, something changed. I was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames, when I heard movement just beyond the circle of light. It wasn't the soft scurry of a small animal. It was heavier, deliberate, leaves crunching slow like steps. I froze, trying not to move or breathe too loud. The fire popped, sparks lifting into the air, but I kept my eyes fixed on the tree line. Nothing appeared. No glowing eyes, no animal shape. Just silence after the sound stopped. I waited, telling myself it was probably a deer. I had seen tracks earlier, big enough to belong to one. Still, I felt my heart hammering in my chest. I banked the fire lower than usual and retreated to the tent. Inside, with the flap zipped tight, I laid on my back and listened hard. At some point, I must have drifted into a light sleep because I woke up to another sound, this time closer. Something brushing against the nylon wall of the tent. A slow drag like a hand or paw sliding along the fabric. I held still, every muscle locked. The sound circled partway around before stopping. I waited in silence, afraid to even shift. Minutes crawled. Eventually it faded, footsteps crunching into the woods. I stayed awake until dawn, eyes wide in the dim light of early morning, my body aching from lying so stiff. When the sun finally rose, I stepped out. Nothing looked disturbed. No tracks I could see in the pine needles. Just my camp, quiet and ordinary. I tried to push the thought down, convince myself I'd exaggerated what I heard. Maybe wind had moved the branches against the tent. Maybe an animal sniffed around and wandered off. I spent the day uneasy. I kept glancing over my shoulder while walking, ears tuned for anything out of place. I cut my hike short and returned earlier than planned. I built the fire high that night, sitting close, letting the heat push back the chill creeping in with the evening air. I stared into the woods more than into the flames. Sometime around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow. This time clearer, crunching dry leaves, snapping twigs. I turned my head sharply, eyes straining past the firelight. I couldn't see a figure, but the sound was deliberate. Not wandering like an animal grazing. It was moving around me, keeping distance, circling. My throat went dry. I gripped the small hatchet I'd brought for chopping wood and sat frozen. The steps stopped. The woods fell silent again. My ears rang from the intensity of listening. After long minutes, I forced myself into the tent, clutching the hatchet. I didn't sleep at all. My mind spun with thoughts I couldn't stop. It wasn't a deer. Deer don't circle. And the sound against the tent the night before. Too controlled, too curious. By morning, I decided to leave. I didn't feel safe. I packed my gear fast, stuffing things haphazardly, not caring about neatness. My eyes kept darting to the trees, half expecting something to step out. I loaded the car, started the engine, and drove down that dirt road without looking back. But halfway out, I saw it. Through a gap in the trees, a figure standing still. Not close enough for detail, but clearly human, facing the road, watching. My hands tightened on the wheel, stomach dropping. I didn't slow down. I didn't stop. I drove until the forest thinned, until the dirt gave way to cracked asphalt, until I reached the safety of a town. I never went back. I don't tell many people about it because it sounds vague, like paranoia. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw, even if it was only for a moment. Someone was out there with me, moving in the dark, circling, watching. And the thought that keeps me awake sometimes isn't what they wanted that night. It's the fact that they never tried to show themselves. They were patient. They were content to stay hidden. And that means they had done it before. It was late in the afternoon when I finally pulled off the highway and turned onto the long dirt road that led deep into the woods. I had been driving for hours, my back aching from sitting too long, and the silence of the forest around me was almost a relief compared to the endless noise of traffic and people I had left behind. The road was rough, with patches of mud from the rain earlier in the week, and every bump rattled the inside of the car. Dust rose behind me in the mirror, hanging in the air as if no one had traveled this way for days. I was heading toward a small cabin I had rented for a few nights. I had wanted time away from everything, somewhere without neighbors or constant noise, somewhere I could just sit in peace and hear nothing but the wind and maybe the sound of water moving in a creek. The cabin was far from town, tucked deep inside a stretch of forest where cell signal barely reached. It was the kind of place where people rarely came unless they had a reason, and that was part of why I chose it. The sun was dropping lower when I finally saw the cabin. It was small and simple, sitting in a clearing with trees pressed tightly all around it. The wood was darkened with age, and the roof had a patch of green moss along one edge. A single dirt path circled around the cabin and disappeared back into the forest. I parked the car, stepped out, and was met with that heavy stillness that only deep woods can have. The air was damp, carrying the faint smell of pine and wet soil. Inside, the cabin was basic but clean. A wooden table stood near the window, a narrow bed was pushed against the wall, and a small wood stove sat in the corner with a neat pile of logs beside it. There was no electricity, just a lantern on the table and a box of matches. The water came from a pump just outside. It was exactly what I had expected, exactly what I thought I wanted. I unpacked slowly, putting away food I had brought in a small cooler, stacking a few books on the table, and laying out my sleeping bag on the bed. I could hear the forest settling as evening came on, the cries of birds fading, the wind whispering through branches, the occasional snap of something moving in the undergrowth far away. By the time the last light drained from the sky, I had lit the lantern and sat at the table listening to the faint creaks of the cabin adjusting to the cooling night. At first, everything was calm. I cooked a simple meal on the stove, ate, and then stepped outside to walk around the clearing. The night was clear, and stars showed through the gaps in the treetops. I stood there for a long time, breathing in the cool air, until I finally went back inside and prepared to sleep. The first sound came around midnight. I had been lying in bed half asleep when I heard something faint outside, a sound that didn't belong to the usual rhythm of the forest. It was a dull thud, almost like a footstep, followed by the faint crunch of dry leaves. My heart beat a little faster, but I told myself it could have been anything, a deer, a raccoon, maybe even a branch falling. I lay there waiting, holding my breath, but the sound faded and didn't return. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep. The next day was quiet. I spent the morning walking along a narrow trail that led deeper into the forest. The path wound between tall trees, their trunks thick and close together, their branches blocking much of the light. The deeper I went, the more I felt cut off from everything else. There were no signs of people, no litter, no footprints, just the packed dirt trail and the endless stretch of trees. I followed the path until I reached a small creek. The water was clear, and I sat by it for a while, watching it run over the rocks. It was peaceful, but there was an uneasiness under it, a sense that I wasn't completely alone. I kept glancing back at the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing. By late afternoon, I returned to the cabin. I gathered wood for the stove, cooked dinner, and tried to relax. The silence seemed heavier now, like the woods were pressing in closer. I sat at the table reading by the lantern until my eyes grew tired. That night, the noises came back. I woke to the sound of movement outside, closer this time. It wasn't quick or random like an animal foraging. It was slow, steady, deliberate, something moving through the leaves with weight. I lay perfectly still, listening. The sound circled the cabin, stopping every now and then before continuing again. My skin crawled. I thought about getting up and checking, but the thought of looking out the window and actually seeing something filled me with dread. After what felt like hours, the sound faded again, and I eventually fell back asleep. In the morning, I went outside and walked around the cabin. The ground was damp with dew, the leaves wet and soft, but in some patches of dirt I saw faint impressions. Shapes that could have been footprints, though blurred and hard to make out. I crouched down, studying them, but told myself I was just seeing patterns in the dirt. Still, unease settled deeper in my chest. The third night was worse. I had trouble sleeping, half expecting the sounds to return. And they did. Around the same hour, the crunch of leaves came again, louder now, as if whoever, or whatever, it was no longer cared to hide. I could hear it moving close to the cabin walls, stopping just outside. My breath was shallow, my body tense. The lantern was dark, but a thin sliver of moonlight slipped in through the cracks of the shutters. Then I heard it, something brushing against the wood. Not scratching, not an animal clawing, but the sound of fabric or skin sliding slowly along the wall. My chest tightened, and every muscle in me was screaming to do something, but I stayed frozen, my eyes locked on the ceiling. After minutes that felt like hours, the sound moved away. When morning came, I was exhausted. I told myself I would leave, but part of me wanted to believe I was overreacting. Maybe it was just someone passing by. Maybe it was hunters or locals. I tried to convince myself, but the truth was harder to ignore. That afternoon, I forced myself to check the area again. I walked into the trees behind the cabin, scanning the ground carefully. About 50 yards in, I found it, a patch of flattened leaves and disturbed dirt, as if someone had stood there for a long time watching. My stomach turned. From that spot, the cabin was clearly visible through the trees. I knew then it wasn't an animal. Someone had been out there. Someone had been watching. I went back inside and locked the door, though the thin wood of the cabin didn't feel like much protection. The rest of the day dragged on slowly, each sound outside making me flinch. I barely ate, too tense to relax. I lit the lantern early, sitting close to it like the light alone could keep the dark away. When night came, I didn't lie down. I sat on the bed, my ears straining. The forest outside was alive with its usual sounds, the occasional call of an owl, the wind in the branches. But underneath it all, I kept waiting for the steps. And eventually they came. This time, they didn't circle. They approached directly, heavy and slow, until they stopped just outside the cabin door. My whole body was tight with fear, my pulse hammering so hard it made me dizzy. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint sound of breathing, long, steady breaths that were not my own, coming from the other side of the door. I stayed frozen, my eyes locked on the handle. I half expected it to turn, but it never did. After what felt like endless minutes, the steps retreated, moving back into the trees. I didn't sleep at all that night. As soon as the first light touched the clearing, I packed my things in a rush, shoving everything into bags without care. I loaded the car and didn't look back at the cabin. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel, my eyes flicking constantly to the mirrors as I drove back down the dirt road. Even once I reached the main highway, I couldn't calm down. The thought of those footsteps, of someone standing outside in the dark listening to me breathe, sank deep into me. I knew it hadn't been my imagination. I had felt it too strongly. I didn't tell anyone when I got back. What could I say? That I rented a cabin and someone stalked me at night. There was no proof, nothing but faint footprints and the sound of breathing. But the memory clung to me, sharper than anything else I had ever felt. I never went back to that cabin, and I never tried to stay anywhere that far from people again. The silence of the woods, once something I thought I wanted, now only reminded me of that night. The night when someone stood outside in the darkness, watching, waiting, and never once showing their face. I remember the night clearly, even though years have passed, because it settled in my memory in a way that refuses to fade. I had gone on a trip by myself, something I rarely did. It wasn't a vacation, not in the way people normally think about it. I just wanted some time away from everything, away from people, away from the noise. away from the constant pull of everyday life. I had borrowed my uncle's small cabin that sat deep in the woods, far from town. It was old but sturdy, with a single bedroom, a small kitchen, and a creaking porch that looked out at the dense trees. The drive there had taken most of the day. I remember how the paved road had turned into gravel, then eventually into a dirt track where trees closed in on both sides. My phone lost its signal miles before I reached the cabin. That had been part of the plan, though. I wanted silence. The cabin itself wasn't much, but it felt private. There were no neighbors within sight, just a stretch of woods, hills, and a stream that I could hear if the wind blew the right way. The first evening felt peaceful. I unpacked my things slowly, set up some food on the counter, and walked around the cabin to check that everything was in decent shape. The roof looked fine, the windows intact. Inside smelled faintly of old wood and dust, the kind of smell you notice at first but quickly get used to. I sat on the porch until the sun went down, watching the sky shift from blue to gray, then to the deep black that swallows up the forest. Out there, away from city lights, the dark felt heavier, thicker, almost pressing against my skin. I lit a lantern inside and tried to read a book, but the silence was so strong it felt like sound itself had been removed from the world. Every time the cabin creaked, every time the wind brushed against the trees, my attention snapped away from the page. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind adjusting to being alone. The first night passed without much trouble, though I woke up a few times. The stillness outside was so total that even the faintest sound, a distant snap of a twig, the scratch of branches against the siding, jolted me awake. I would lie there, staring at the ceiling, waiting to hear more. Sometimes nothing followed. Other times, I swore I caught the faint crunch of steps in the undergrowth, but it could have been animals. The next day, I decided to explore the woods around the cabin. I followed a narrow path that led downhill toward the stream. The trees were thick, branches woven so close in some places they blocked most of the light. The air was damp, cool, and filled with the smell of wet leaves and moss. I remember pausing by the stream, crouching down to watch the water twist around rocks. It felt untouched, wild, and I realized then how truly alone I was. On the way back, I noticed something odd. Just off the path, there was a section of the ground that looked disturbed. The soil was darker, pressed down unevenly, as if something, or someone, had walked over it many times. I crouched down, brushing away leaves, and saw what looked like a partial footprint in the dirt. It was faint, hard to tell if it was really from a person or just an odd shape left by rain and fallen branches. Still, it stuck in my mind. When I got back to the cabin, I tried to shake the feeling off. It could have been a hunter, maybe, or someone hiking. The woods weren't private property. Anyone could be out there. That night, though, I kept thinking about it. The cabin had no curtains in the main room, and when I sat at the small table eating dinner, I could see straight out into the dark woods. The lantern cast my reflection against the glass, but behind that reflection was nothing but blackness. I couldn't help but imagine someone standing just beyond the tree line watching. Later, when I went to bed, I locked the front door, though I hadn't the night before. I even slid a chair under the knob, something I hadn't done since I was a kid. Sleep came in fits, and sometime past midnight, I woke to a sound. It was faint, but enough to stir me. I held my breath, listening. There it was again, the crunch of leaves, slow, deliberate. Not the quick scatter of an animal, not the random falling of branches. Steps. I didn't move. I just lay there, every muscle tense, staring at the ceiling. The sound circled the cabin, one slow step at a time. It wasn't close to the walls, more like someone was keeping just far enough away to stay hidden in the dark, walking around in a slow loop. After what felt like forever, the sound faded, blending back into silence. I barely slept after that. The next morning, I checked outside. There were no clear footprints on the ground around the cabin, just leaves and damp earth. I told myself maybe it had been a deer or a bear, something large enough to make that noise, moving slow because it was sniffing around. That made sense, but it didn't sit right. The day dragged. I couldn't focus on reading or walking far from the cabin. Every time I stepped off the porch, I felt like eyes followed me. The disturbed patch of ground I'd seen near the stream replayed in my head. Maybe someone had been out there, someone I hadn't seen. By evening, my nerves were raw. I cooked a simple meal, but I barely touched it. The forest outside was already dim, and shadows bled into each other. I decided to keep the lanterns lit and stay inside. As night deepened, the silence grew heavier. Hours passed in that stillness until finally, it came again, the sound. This time it was closer. The steps weren't circling wide. They came right up to the side of the cabin, stopping now and then. I could hear the weight of each step pressing leaves and twigs into the soil. My heart pounded so loud I swore it might echo through the walls. I sat frozen in the chair by the window, staring at the black glass. My own reflection stared back, but I couldn't see what was outside. Then there was a scrape, soft but unmistakable, like something brushing against the siding. It moved slowly along the wall, toward the window. I blew out the lantern in a rush of panic, plunging the cabin into darkness. My eyes adjusted slowly, and I sat there in the dark, holding my breath, listening. The scrape stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then came a sound so quiet I almost doubted it. The faint shift of weight right outside the window, as if someone was standing there. My chest ached from holding my breath. I waited frozen, until at last, after what felt like an hour, the steps moved away. They faded back into the trees, one by one, until silence reclaimed the night. I didn't sleep at all. I stayed in the dark until the first pale light of morning crept through the glass. When I finally dared step outside, the ground by the cabin looked different. The leaves were pressed down, the soil disturbed. They weren't animal tracks. They were footprints, large and clear, circling the cabin. I packed my things the moment I saw them. I stuffed clothes into my bag, barely folded, threw food back into containers, and loaded everything into my car. The entire time, I kept glancing at the tree line, half expecting someone to step out. I didn't even bother to clean the cabin or check if I left anything behind. When I finally started the car and drove down the dirt road, I didn't look back. I kept driving until I reached the paved road and finally saw other cars. Only then did I feel my chest loosen. I never told anyone in detail about what happened. If I did, they'd say it was a hunter or some drifter passing through the woods. Maybe they'd be right. Maybe it was nothing more than that. But the way those footsteps had circled the cabin, slow and careful, the way they had stopped right at my window in the dead of night, that was not an accident. Someone had been out there, watching me, and they knew I was alone. I never went back to that cabin again. It started out as a normal trip, the kind of plan that doesn't feel like anything unusual at the time. But when I look back on it now, I can see how every little detail lined up to put me where I ended up that night. I had gone up into the hills outside of town, nothing wild or far from civilization, but just enough distance to make me feel like I was away from everything. I brought a small backpack, some food, a water bottle, and a flashlight. I thought it would be nice to spend a night out there alone, to clear my head and just get a break from people. The place I chose wasn't even a proper campsite, more of an open clearing I had stumbled on before when hiking with friends. It was quiet, surrounded by trees on three sides, with a narrow dirt path cutting through and heading further into the woods. To one side, maybe 200 yards away, the land dropped off into a ravine where a shallow creek ran. I could hear the faint trickle of water if I listened hard enough, but most of the sound that night came from the trees swaying and creaking with the light wind. I laid out my small sleeping bag, set up my little camping stove, and cooked myself a simple meal. As the light faded, the sky turned a dull shade of purple, then darker, until only the last glow of the sun lingered behind the ridge. I remember staring at that ridge for a long time because I thought I saw something move up there. It wasn't unusual to see a deer crossing, and I told myself that's all it was, but the shape looked taller, slower. It walked across the ridge without stopping, heading straight in one direction until it vanished on the far side. I sat there watching, my food forgotten for a while, feeling that strange weight in my chest when you notice something you can't quite place, but don't want to admit unsettles you. Darkness came quick after that. The fire I had built was small but steady, crackling in the still air. The sound gave me comfort, as did the light, but the woods beyond stayed pitch black. I kept catching myself staring into that blackness, as if my eyes would adjust enough to see shapes moving. Every now and then, the wind would sweep through, carrying with it the dry rustle of leaves and the shifting creaks of old branches. My mind played tricks, turning those sounds into footsteps that never came any closer. After a while, I decided to walk just inside the tree line to gather a bit more firewood. I didn't want to run out during the night. I kept the flashlight in one hand and picked up fallen branches with the other. The ground was uneven, covered in roots, patches of leaves, and soft earth that sank slightly under my boots. The beam of light jumped across trunks and brush, making shadows bend and twist in ways that looked unnatural if I stared too long. At one point, I froze. There was a sound behind me, faint but clear enough to separate from the usual noise of the forest. Breathing. Heavy, labored breathing, like someone just out of sight was trying to catch their breath. I spun around with the flashlight, the beam cutting through the dark in sharp slices, but nothing moved. My heart started pounding. I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a deer or something bigger like a stray cow from a nearby farm, but I couldn't shake the thought that it had sounded exactly like a person standing just a few feet away. I waited, holding my breath, listening as hard as I could. The sound drifted further off, fading until it mixed with the wind again. I almost dropped the wood I had gathered, but I forced myself to carry it back, walking faster than before, nearly tripping in my rush. When I stepped back into the glow of the fire, I felt the tension ease slightly, like the light itself built a wall that nothing could cross. I sat by the fire for a long time after that, barely eating, just staring at the trees. My mind wouldn't let go of the sound I had heard. Every crunch of leaves in the distance, every snap of a branch, felt like a warning. I kept thinking back to that figure on the ridge. Whoever it was, if it was a person, they had been walking in a straight line, without pause, like they had somewhere to go. I wondered if that somewhere was here, where I was now. By the time I finally lay down in my sleeping bag, the fire had burned low. The air had grown colder, the kind of cold that bites through layers and settles into your skin. I pulled the bag tight around my shoulders and tried to close my eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. I listened too closely to the night, waiting for something, anything, to happen. My ears felt sharper than ever, picking up distant noises that I'd normally never notice. Sometime past midnight, I heard it again. Breathing, faint but steady. This time it wasn't moving away, it was closer. The sound had weight, like lungs working harder than they should. My eyes shot open, and though the fire was just a bed of glowing embers now, there was enough light to see a faint outline beyond the circle of camp. I couldn't make it out clearly, but there was definitely movement between the trees. Not fast, not direct, but there. I stayed frozen in place, barely daring to move. The sound shifted, then faded again, the way it had before. I sat up slowly, pulling the flashlight from where I had left it at my side. My hand shook as I clicked it on, the beam spilling out and cutting across trunks, rocks, and brush. Nothing. Empty woods. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. That night stretched on endlessly. I didn't sleep at all. I kept the flashlight close and stirred the embers back into small flames when they threatened to go out. My body felt rigid, locked into a state of waiting. The woods had gone quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of silence that feels unnatural. When the sky finally started to lighten, I felt relief wash through me, but it didn't erase the unease. I packed up quickly, stuffing my gear into the bag with shaking hands. My eyes kept darting to the tree line. I wanted to believe the night was just my mind playing tricks, fueled by shadows and sounds, but deep down, I knew what I had heard. The walk back to the trailhead was slow. Every turn in the path felt dangerous. Every patch of undergrowth seemed like it could hide someone waiting. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced I would see someone following at a distance, but the trail stayed empty. My footsteps sounded louder than normal, echoing through the early morning air. When I finally stepped out of the woods and onto the gravel lot where I had left my car, I felt my whole body relax for the first time in hours. I threw my bag in the back seat and sat behind the wheel, gripping it tightly. I looked back once more at the tree line. It stood there, silent and still in the morning light, hiding whatever had been there with me through the night. Driving away, I couldn't shake the feeling that if I had stayed one more night, something would have happened. I don't know what, and I don't want to imagine it, but I know with certainty that someone else had been in those woods with me. I hadn't imagined the breathing. I hadn't imagined the shadow on the ridge. Whoever it was, they had stayed just out of sight, close enough to hear me, close enough to follow me, and patient enough to wait through the dark. I never went back to that clearing again. Even now, years later, the thought of it brings back that same cold weight in my chest, that certainty that I had come close to something I didn't fully understand, but knew was dangerous. The woods are big, empty places, and at night, you can't always tell what's moving just beyond the reach of the light. And sometimes, whatever is out there doesn't want you to see it until it's too late. I had been looking forward to the trip for weeks. Life in the city had started to feel like a cage, the noise and routines piling up until I could hardly breathe. When my friend mentioned a secluded cabin he knew about, tucked away deep in the woods and far from traffic, people, and all the endless distractions, I agreed to go without even hesitating. The thought of peace and silence seemed like the cure I needed. I packed food, water, extra clothes, and enough supplies to last a few days. The drive itself took hours, the paved roads fading into gravel and then into narrow dirt paths that snaked through tall trees and endless stretches of green. By the time I arrived, the sun was low in the sky, throwing long shadows across the clearing where the cabin stood. It was smaller than I imagined, made of weathered wood with a sagging roof and a small porch. The forest surrounded it on all sides, thick and heavy, pressing in close like it wanted to swallow the place whole. I stepped out of the car and listened. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the distant chirp of birds and the faint rustle of leaves shifting in the evening breeze. I felt both calm and uneasy at the same time, like I was exactly where I wanted to be, but also somewhere I didn't fully belong. Inside, the cabin was simple. One small room with a bed pushed against the wall, a table and chair, and a wood stove in the corner. The air smelled musty, like the cabin had been empty for a long time. Dust coated the surfaces, and spiderwebs clung to the corners of the ceiling. I unpacked slowly, putting away food and setting my sleeping bag on the bed. By the time I finished, night had already settled in, thick and heavy. I sat outside on the porch for a while, staring at the sky. Without city lights, the stars stretched endlessly, sharp and bright against the darkness. The quiet was deeper now, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the distant snap of a branch in the woods. The first night passed quietly. I woke once to the sound of something moving outside, maybe a deer or raccoon, but it faded quickly, and I fell back asleep. The morning came cold, the air damp with dew. I made coffee on a small camp stove and sat on the porch again, watching the sunlight filter through the trees. It was peaceful, and for most of the day I explored the woods, wandering down narrow trails and listening to the sounds of the forest. But later that afternoon, something shifted. I was about half a mile from the cabin, walking slowly through a patch of thick trees, when I heard it. A heavy crack, like someone stepping on a large branch. I froze, scanning the trees, waiting for an animal to appear. The forest went quiet, too quiet. The birds stopped, the rustling leaves seemed to pause, and I felt my chest tighten. I told myself it was nothing, just a deer, maybe a bear, something natural. But the sound had been heavy, deliberate. I turned and headed back to the cabin, moving faster than before, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. That night, I couldn't relax. Every sound outside seemed louder, sharper. The scrape of branches against the cabin, the shifting creaks of the wood, the rustle of leaves carried by the wind. I sat on the bed, staring at the door, listening. At some point, exhaustion pulled me under, but I woke again around 3 in the morning. This time, I knew I hadn't imagined it. There was movement outside. Slow, heavy steps, crunching softly against the ground, circling the cabin. My heart thudded, so hard it felt like it would break through my chest. I stayed perfectly still, my eyes fixed on the door. The steps paused, then shifted again, moving past the windows. The cabin was too dark for me to see clearly, but I could make out the faintest suggestion of a shadow passing across the glass. My mouth went dry. I didn't breathe. I waited, straining to hear, but after a long moment, the sound faded. The silence that followed was almost worse. The rest of the night stretched endlessly. Every creak of the cabin made me flinch. At first light, I stepped outside carefully. The clearing looked the same, the woods calm and still. But then I noticed the ground near the porch. In the soft dirt, clear as day, were footprints. Large, heavy boot prints, circling the cabin and leading back into the trees. The sight made my stomach twist. I was miles from the nearest town, no neighbors around, no one who should have been out there. Someone had been walking around the cabin in the middle of the night, watching. I thought about leaving right then, packing up and driving back, but a part of me refused to run. I told myself it could have been a hunter, someone lost, maybe even just passing through. But deep down, I didn't believe it. The second day dragged on. I couldn't focus on anything. Every time I tried to step into the woods, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, scanning the trees for movement. I ended up staying close to the cabin, sitting on the porch with a knife by my side, just waiting. Hours passed like that, the sun crawling slowly across the sky. By the time night came again, my nerves were stretched thin. I locked the door, pulled the chair against it, and sat awake with the knife in my hand. For a long time, nothing happened. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard it again. The same slow, steady steps crunching closer. This time they didn't circle. They stopped right outside the cabin. I could hear breathing, heavy and slow, just beyond the wall. My skin prickled. I sat frozen, my grip tightening on the knife. Minutes dragged on, and the sound didn't move. Whoever it was just stood there, waiting. Finally, the footsteps shifted. I heard them move toward the window, the soft scrape of something brushing against the glass. My heart pounded. Then silence again. I waited, every muscle locked, listening for the next sound. But it never came. At some point, exhaustion broke me, and I must have drifted into a restless sleep. Morning came, and I forced myself outside. The same boot prints were there, fresh in the dirt, pressed right up against the cabin wall beneath the window. Whoever it was had stood there for a long time watching. That was when I knew I couldn't stay. I packed quickly, shoving everything back into the car, my hands shaking the whole time. I kept glancing at the woods, half expecting someone to step out and watch me leave. The drive out felt endless, every shadow on the roadside making me grip the wheel tighter. I didn't relax until the trees thinned and the paved roads returned. Even then, the unease didn't leave me. I kept replaying it in my head. The sound of those steps, the stillness outside the cabin, the footprints pressed deep into the earth. It hadn't been an animal. It hadn't been an accident. Someone had come out into the middle of nowhere, in the dead of night, just to circle that cabin. Someone had been standing there, inches away from me, watching through the glass. And the part that kept me awake long after I got home was the realization that whoever it was hadn't tried to break in. They hadn't rushed the door or smashed a window. They hadn't made a sound beyond those slow, steady steps. They were waiting, watching, and they knew exactly where I was. I had not planned for the night to turn into something I would remember for the rest of my life. It was supposed to be simple, calm, uneventful. I had driven out to the old cabin that sat at the edge of a wooded valley, far from the nearest town. It was one of those places I visited when I needed quiet, where the hum of city life could not reach me. The air was always different out there, sharper, colder at night, and the silence could stretch so deep it almost rang in my ears. The cabin was basic, nothing more than a wooden frame with a tin roof, a single room with a small stove, and a cot in the corner. There was no electricity, no phone service, just the sound of wind moving through the trees and the smell of damp earth that always seemed to cling to the valley floor. I arrived in the late afternoon, parking the truck at the narrow clearing that passed as a driveway. The ground was soft from recent rain, and my boots sank into the mud as I carried a bag of supplies inside. By the time I set everything down and started a small fire in the stove, the light outside was already fading. Twilight in the woods is never like twilight in the open. The trees absorb the last of the sun, pulling the sky into darkness before you even realize it's happening. Shadows grow quickly, and soon the forest seems to press itself against the cabin walls, as if it wants to take back the small patch of cleared land the cabin sat on. At first, the night was uneventful. I ate a simple meal of canned soup, warmed on the stove, and then stretched out on the cot, listening to the steady crackle of the fire. The roof ticked as it cooled, and now and then I heard the creak of wood shifting in the walls. It was normal, sounds I had heard before. The sort of noises you stop noticing after enough visits. But sometime after midnight, I woke up. My eyes opened in the dark, and I wasn't sure why at first. The fire had died down, leaving only a faint orange glow in the stove, not enough to light the room. The kind of glow that barely holds back the dark. My body felt tense, alert, as if it had woken itself out of instinct. My ears strained. That was when I realized the silence was too heavy. The usual night sounds, the rustle of leaves, the call of distant animals, the small tapping of branches against one another, were gone. The woods had gone completely still. I stayed on the cot for a long moment, my breath shallow, barely moving. Then I heard it. A sound that was so soft I thought at first I had imagined it. The crunch of footsteps on damp leaves, slow and deliberate. Not the scatter of an animal, not the light hop of a deer. This was heavy, careful, moving with a rhythm that only a person could make. My skin prickled, and a cold weight settled in my stomach. I sat up as quietly as I could, trying to control the creak of the cot frame beneath me. I could feel the sweat forming on my palms, even though the room was cold. The sound came again, closer this time, then stopped. The silence that followed was even worse, stretched tight and waiting. I moved slowly to the small window by the stove. The glass was old, cloudy, and in the faint light from the embers I could see little more than shapes outside. The trees stood in crooked lines, their branches shifting slightly in a weak breeze. Nothing else moved. I pressed my ear closer, straining for any sound. Then I heard it again, this time to the left, near the side of the cabin. Leaves pressing under weight, a branch snapping. Someone was out there. I knew it as clearly as I knew the beat of my own heart. I thought of the truck parked outside, but the keys were on the small table across the room. If I made too much noise, whoever was out there would hear me. I sat in the dark for what felt like hours, my back against the wall, listening. The footsteps came and went, circling the cabin. Sometimes near, sometimes fading, but always returning. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. They were taking their time. I tried to convince myself it was just a hunter passing through, maybe someone lost, but deep down I knew better. No hunter creeps around a cabin in the middle of the night without calling out. No one moves like that without purpose. The longer it went on, the more certain I became that whoever it was knew I was inside, and they were waiting for me to make a mistake. At one point, I thought I heard breathing outside the window. Slow, heavy, close enough that it felt like the glass might fog if I stared long enough. I didn't dare move. My muscles ached from holding still, my legs numb from sitting pressed against the wall, but I couldn't force myself to shift. Eventually, exhaustion began to drag at me. My eyelids felt heavy, my thoughts slow, but each time I almost drifted, the crunch of footsteps snapped me awake again. The hours stretched endlessly, the darkness thick and suffocating. I checked the faint light of my watch when I could, but time seemed to move differently out there. What felt like a full night turned out to be only a couple of hours. Just before dawn, when the first pale light began to touch the trees, the sounds finally stopped. The silence outside was different this time, lighter, no longer weighed down by the presence of something unseen. I stayed frozen until the sky turned a dull gray, then finally stood, my legs weak and unsteady beneath me. I moved to the window again, peering out as the forest slowly revealed itself. Nothing stirred. No figure stood among the trees. But when I finally stepped outside, the ground told a different story. The mud around the cabin was full of prints, deep and clear. They circled the cabin again and again, pausing here and there, some pressed right up against the walls as if the person had leaned close to listen. I followed them a few feet into the trees, but they faded quickly into the undergrowth, swallowed by the forest floor. My chest tightened as I realized how close they had been, how many times they had walked past as I sat inside listening, waiting. I went back to the cabin, locked the door, and gathered my things. I didn't bother making breakfast. I didn't even bother cleaning up. By the time the sun had fully risen, I was driving down the narrow dirt road, the cabin shrinking in my rearview mirror. Even now, I can still picture those prints in the mud, circling, lingering, never entering but never leaving. Whoever it was had stayed out there the whole night, just beyond the thin walls, patient and silent. And though I never saw their face, I knew enough to understand that they hadn't been passing through. They had come for me, or maybe for anyone foolish enough to sleep alone in a cabin in the woods. I never went back after that. The cabin still stands, I'm sure, but I couldn't bring myself to return. The thought of lying in that cot again, knowing someone could be just outside in the dark, waiting, was enough to keep me away. Sometimes I wonder if the person ever came back, circling the empty cabin, realizing it was vacant. Other times I wonder if they've found someone else since. Either way, the memory of that night is enough to remind me that the silence of the woods is never as empty as it seems. It started on a cool autumn afternoon, the kind of day where the air feels heavy with the smell of dry leaves and distant wood smoke. The sun was still out, but it was slipping lower in the sky, spilling an orange glow across the trees that surrounded the place I had decided to explore. I had driven out of town on a back road I didn't normally use, just looking for a quiet spot to walk, to clear my head, maybe take some pictures. I didn't have a real plan. That was always a mistake when you're heading into places you don't know well, but I wasn't thinking about that at the time. The road was cracked and narrow, swallowed on both sides by thick forest. The trees were tall and close, their branches leaning over the asphalt like they were trying to cage it in. I had the windows of the car rolled down, and I could hear nothing but the hum of my tires and the occasional cry of a crow. No other cars passed me, and I hadn't seen a house in miles. I spotted a small pull-off ahead where the ground opened into a gravel shoulder, so I slowed and turned in. There was a faint dirt path at the edge of the trees, half hidden by weeds, and it looked like it had been there for decades. I cut the engine, and the silence fell in around me almost instantly. Even the crows were gone now. I sat in the car for a minute, just listening to the nothingness, before I opened the door. The air was sharp and cold as soon as I stepped out, and I could hear the dry crunch of gravel under my boots. I grabbed my small backpack from the seat, slung it over one shoulder, and walked to the start of the trail. The ground was damp beneath the thin carpet of fallen leaves. My steps felt loud, almost too loud, in the stillness of the woods. The trail wound forward into the trees, twisting gently until it swallowed the view of the road. After about 10 minutes of walking, I realized the forest felt different than the woods I normally hiked. The trees were closer together, thicker, their bark dark and damp with moss. The air had a weight to it that clung to my skin, and the smell was sharper, like wet earth mixed with something stale. I kept walking because I wanted to see where it led. The trail narrowed as I went, dropping in and out of shallow dips in the earth, but it stayed clear enough to follow. The ground was uneven, covered with roots that pushed up through the dirt, forcing me to keep my eyes low so I wouldn't trip. I noticed that the further I went, the darker it seemed, even though the sun was still up. The trees knitted tighter overhead, blocking most of the light, and the forest floor felt strangely enclosed. After maybe half an hour, I came across what looked like an old stone wall running parallel to the trail. It was broken and half buried under vines, but it stretched far in both directions. I stopped and studied it, wondering why it was here, this deep in the woods. Someone had built it a long time ago, and judging by the size, it might have marked a property line or an old farm boundary. The thought of there being farmland out here, in a place now swallowed by forest, made me uneasy. I wondered how long ago people had abandoned it, and why. I pushed further down the trail, passing the wall until it finally veered off and disappeared. My boots sank into patches of soft earth, and once or twice I thought I heard movement in the underbrush off to my left. I froze when it happened, holding my breath, scanning the trees, but I never saw anything. The sound was faint, just the soft crack of twigs or a faint shuffle of leaves. Each time it happened, it felt closer. By the time I noticed how far I'd gone, it was too late to turn back without walking in the dark. The sun was sliding lower and the air was colder, heavy with dampness. I pulled out my phone to check the time, but the signal was gone. The battery icon showed it was draining faster than usual, like it always did in areas with no service. I put it back in my pocket and kept walking, figuring the trail had to loop somewhere, maybe toward another road. That was when I noticed the smell. It wasn't the earthy scent of wet leaves anymore. It was something sharper, sour, like rotting meat. It came in waves, faint at first, then stronger as I followed the curve of the path. My stomach turned as it hit me, and I pulled my jacket collar up over my mouth. I thought maybe it was a dead deer, caught somewhere in the brush, but the smell was too strong, too wide, like it wasn't just one spot, but hanging in the air all around. I slowed my steps, straining my ears. That was when I heard it again, the shuffle. Not in the distance this time, but close. Too close. It sounded heavy, dragging, like something moving with weight. I froze mid-step, trying not to make a sound, but my boot had already cracked a twig. The noise in the brush stopped. The silence after was worse than the smell. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck prickling, my pulse hammering so hard it made my head throb. I told myself it was probably just an animal, a boar maybe, or even a bear. But the thought didn't make me feel better, because being alone with either of those in thick woods was no safer. I started walking again, faster now, not running but moving with urgency. My breathing grew louder in my ears, too fast, and the trail seemed narrower the further I went. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but all I could see were the trunks of the trees stretching back into darkness. Then the smell thickened, overwhelming, so strong it coated my tongue. I gagged and pulled my collar tighter. My eyes watered from it, but I forced myself to keep going. That was when I saw it ahead of me, a clearing. The trail spilled out into a flat space where the trees opened just enough for the last of the sunlight to filter through. I stepped into it cautiously, scanning the ground. That was when I saw the bones. They were scattered across the dirt and leaves, pale against the brown earth. Some were small, maybe from deer, but others were larger, longer, thicker than I wanted to admit. Some still had dark patches of dried flesh clinging to them. My throat tightened, and I felt bile rising as I forced myself to look closer. The bones weren't just scattered randomly. They were piled. A few were stacked, like someone had dragged them here. The sour smell was choking now, heavy in the air. I looked around the clearing and saw more, half buried in leaves, some snapped in half. The edges weren't chewed the way animals usually left them. They were split clean, sharp, like tools had been used. My chest was tight with panic. I didn't want to stay there another second, but as I turned back toward the trail, I heard it again. Movement. Slow, heavy, deliberate. This time it wasn't to the side. It was directly behind me, coming from the same trail I had just walked. I couldn't see anything in the dark trees. My heart slammed in my chest as I backed further into the clearing, my eyes locked on the path. I didn't want to move deeper, but I couldn't stand with my back to the forest either. The sound grew louder, closer. Whoever, or whatever, was out there wasn't bothering to stay hidden anymore. I knew I couldn't outrun it on the narrow trail. The ground was too rough, and if I tripped, I'd never get up in time. My only chance was to break through the trees, away from the trail, and hope I found another way out. I turned and pushed into the woods, branches whipping against my arms and face. The ground dropped unevenly, and my boots slid on wet leaves. I stumbled, nearly fell, but kept moving. Behind me, I heard the heavy steps following, crashing through brush, not fast but steady, as if it knew I couldn't keep this up for long. I don't know how long I ran. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were filled with lead. The forest was darker now, almost black, and I could barely see where I was going. Every step was a risk, every branch a claw pulling at my jacket. I finally stopped, chest heaving, forcing myself to listen. The forest was silent again. I stood there, bent over, sucking in cold air that cut my throat, trying to hear past the hammering of my heart. For a moment, there was nothing. Then I caught it, a faint sound, distant but there. Breathing. Slow, heavy, steady, somewhere in the trees around me. I couldn't tell where it came from. It echoed in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint. I turned slowly, scanning the black trunks, but the forest all looked the same. I didn't dare call out. I didn't dare make a sound. I forced myself to move again, slower this time, pushing through the trees in the direction I thought the road might be. My phone was useless. My sense of direction was slipping. Every tree looked like the last, every slope of the ground identical. But I kept moving, one step at a time, until finally the ground slanted upward, and I broke out of the tree line onto a strip of gravel. It was the road. Relief flooded me so fast my knees nearly buckled. I staggered to the edge and looked both ways, trying to figure out which direction I had parked. My chest was still heaving, my throat raw, but the silence pressed in again. Too quiet. Then I heard it. Behind me. From the trees. That same slow, steady breathing. I didn't wait. I ran down the road, not caring which way, just running. The gravel crunched under my boots, sharp and loud in the night air. My legs screamed with every step, but I didn't stop until I saw the faint reflection of my car's windows down the curve of the road. I reached it and fumbled for my keys with shaking hands. My breath fogged in the cold air as I yanked the door open and threw myself inside, slamming it shut and locking it. My chest heaved as I started the engine, the sound shattering the silence around me. For a moment, I sat there with my hands tight on the wheel, staring into the rearview mirror. The trees stood dark and silent behind me. Nothing moved. No sound. Just stillness. I drove out of there fast, gravel spitting under the tires, not slowing until the trees thinned and I saw the open stretch of highway ahead. Only then did I let myself breathe, the shaking in my hands refusing to stop. I don't know what was in those woods. I don't want to know. But I know it was real, and it was close, and if I had stayed even a little longer, I might not have made it out. And I will never set foot on that trail